I'm David Fiore.
I'm Elise Moore.
This week, Ethan Mordden's The Hollywood Studios.
So this is the beginning of a series. Yet another introduction. We're front-loading our podcast with introductions.
This is a book that was definitely instrumental in getting me to think about movies from this period in a certain way. Great to apply many different lenses to films.
Well, that's what I find of value in you bringing this book to my attention, that a lot of discourse about film seems to be stuck in either the auteurist mode, which has a tendency to devolve into hero worship, or other pernicious things, which I won't enumerate right now, or the star mode, which tends to devolve into, like each of these things has their dark parody, and that tends to devolve into gossip and fandom.
Yeah, paparazzi talk, basically. The auteur theory, La politique des auteurs, from the Cahiers de Cinéma in the 50s. What were they talking about? They were talking about how certain heroic artists managed to make movies their way, even though they were being pushed to the wall by a company called a studio. So it is kind of perverse, I suppose, of Ethan Mordden to argue the absolute opposite in this case.
You can definitely tell from the last chapter, which I just finished reading, you can definitely tell that he doesn't consider himself an auteurist and that he takes offense at them somewhat. But I wouldn't say he's actually arguing. He just doesn't get involved with talking about most of the auteurs because most of them were in fact, and this is kind of a problem for the Cahiers theory, were in fact independent artists, or half of them, or many of them.
Right.
The academics really extended what it meant to be an auteur from what I understand it originally had meant.
Yeah, the original thrust of it was, here I am a sharp-eyed cinephile. I'm going to go looking through all the films of Howard Hawks, and I am going to note his little touches here and there.
Sure, but Howard Hawks wasn't primarily associated with a studio.
Well, this is what I'm getting at.
This is what I'm getting at.
The fascinating thing is that when they talked about the auteurs, what they talked about was the auteur versus the system, or versus business culture in general. The culture industry, as Adorno would have it, right? So nobody on any side was talking about, hey, each studio is kind of like an auteur. Each studio has its own very specific way of doing things. When you're talking about an auteur, you're talking about them resisting the pressures of Philistinism in general, right? Business culture. So it wasn't Howard Hawks resisting any one studio. It was Howard Hawks resisting crass commercialism.
That's debatable.
But that's how they talked about it, right? Just the idea of assembly line filmmaking in general. Nobody was actually taking the time to sit down.
Okay, so the auteurs then were filmmakers who were opposed to the studio system, who were working concurrently with it, but were not part of that system. So that was part of the original definition, you're saying?
Well, I'm just saying that when they were identifying the auteurs, they didn't trouble themselves about which studio they were resisting. They were just talking about them resisting Hollywood as a monolith.
But what I was saying is that a lot of the auteurs, people like Howard Hawks, people like Alfred Hitchcock, were independent.
Yeah, but
were
they're
moving
not
around, were freelance.
But of course they're not...
Or had their own production companies.
They're not really independent, because they still had to ask money men to furnish
But they're independent
everything.
As opposed to the way that Mordden is talking about.
Yeah, not under big studio contracts, a lot of them, although many of them
Talking
were.
about filmmaking. But then this became extended, as Mordden is talking about in his final chapter, in the Universal chapter. Auteurism, by academic critics, as far as I'm aware, became extended to include people who were under studio contract and who you could not initially tell were rebellious in any way, just because you could find, arguably, a signature in their movies.
Yeah.
So John Stahl, for example.
Sure.
Working maybe backwards from Douglas Sirk.
Douglas Sirk also was under exclusive contract to Universal throughout his American period, which is what is celebrated. So.
Yeah, but everyone knew he was an artist because he came from Europe and talked about it. So you could work backwards from that. And that also goes against, like, the original Cahiers definition was applied to American filmmakers who downplayed their role as artists.
American or British. Hitchcock was one of the first. Because it was, like, Hitchcocko Hawks.
Hitchcocko Hawks. So yeah, and there's the Truffaut Hitchcock book.
Yeah. So Hitchcock was one of the touchstone auteurs as well. It didn't matter who he was working for, he just made movies to please himself.
So that's our rough knowledge of auteurism.
And the first conscious auteurist, although he didn't use the word auteur, was Frank Capra, absolutely, because he would tell anyone who would listen from the 30s onward about his politics of one man, one film.
Did the Cahiers critics even use the term auteur, or was that Sarah's invention? Remember, we never went to film school.
It was called La Politique des Auteurs. Yeah,
Okay.
So they definitely used that term. Capra was using the concept long before them. And certainly people like Hawks and Ford, although they wouldn't actually stand up and tell anyone that, because that would have been unmanly. But Capra did not have any qualms about telling everyone, I made this movie, this is my movie, my name goes above the title. And Mordden does work all of that in, and he talks about how Capra was able to do that without very many compromises, certainly in the 30s, because he was working at Columbia, which is not a studio covered by this book. So what are the studios covered by this book? I guess that's a decent segue. And I guess a little bit more about the book. It was released in 1989. Got my copy here, my initial copy from 1989. This last reading has broken it, I think, beyond repair. It's actually ripped in half pretty much now. I got a new one through the wonderful service Better World Books. Didn't even cost that much. Definitely look into it if you're looking for some older books. Shipping is free as well. So we now have a second copy, which Elise read, a copy that is not crumbling. But this one is released by Fireside Books, Simon & Schuster. I bought it at the Kohl's bookstore in downtown Montreal in 1989.
Kohl's comes up again.
Yes, very important.
Is that in America too? Kohl's, or like it's from America, I imagine?
No, I think it's more British.
British?
Well,
Oh.
W.H. Smith
Smith
certainly
was
was.
British.
Maybe we'll look it up.
No, we won't.
Kohl's, though,
We're not going to look it
they
up.
all became chapters in Canada. And then they became...
I guess, yeah, they eventually bought. No, Chapters was a Canadian thing. It was bought by Indigo.
Well, I remember our flagship Kohl's store, which I went to all the time on St. Catherine Street and Stanley, I believe. It became a chapter sometime in the 90s. And I just figured, okay, well, Kohl's are chapters now. I'm not sure if that's true across the board.
It's a little bit of Canadian book culture.
Yeah. So I took it home, I read it, I was getting very heavily involved with watching as many movies as I could from the 30s and 40s, and this guy, Ethan Mordden, was talking about a million other movies that I figured I would never see, because you just had to wait for them to come on PBS. They were certainly not available on VHS, and he talks about what it was like to assemble this book. He has these little asides every once in a while. I remember he was talking about Second Chorus, a kind of obscure Fred Astaire, Burgess Meredith, Paulette Goddard musical with Artie Shaw in it. And he says, you know, when you write a book like this, you have to watch movies like Second Chorus more than once, and they start to grow on you. And I was just like,
Not everything started to grow on him. In
Ethan
fact, most of the
Mordden.
stuff he talks about didn't grow on him.
So lucky. He just watched millions and millions of movies.
So why do you think this appealed to you? Do you think it's because of your historian bent? Or, like, why this way of looking at old movies appealed to you? We didn't specify what we were going to school for so many years, but we both have literary studies background, in addition to which, Dave, it was your undergraduate degree in history?
Yeah, my undergraduate degree was in history, and a lot of my subsequent work had a historical, institutional, political dimension, even though I was working on aesthetic products.
Aesthetic products. Wow, you can tell that person went to university for too long.
What I liked about it more than anything was just the thick description of the studio output during the period that I was most interested in. He goes back to the silent era, but he's mostly talking about the 30s and 40s. And he does go beyond into the 50s and early 60s, just very occasionally when he wants a little flourish about how the studio died out or whatever.
Yeah.
But he really is talking about that period that goes up to the Paramount decision in 1948, which forced the studios to divest themselves of their chains.
Then you're going to have to give a little definition of what is a studio before we can go on. The concrete, not the abstract.
A golden age Hollywood studio.
Now, I'll just say that I actually did take a look at this book during my first and weaker cinephilia period.
Flush of cinephilia?
This is my second. In my early 20s, I definitely looked through this book. I don't believe I read it cover to cover. I think I looked for actors and directors that I was interested in. I was definitely very interested in why Hollywood studio era movies were what they were, the material circumstances of that, and the material circumstances of the process of film production. And so I had like a rudimentary knowledge of some of the personalities of the studios. Personalities who worked at studios, not the personalities of the studios.
Right.
Insofar as there is a distinction. But I never took an interest in knowing which studios made which films.
I don't know what I thought about before this book. It's so
fundamental.
I certainly liked the logos. I took note of the logos from the start. They're all kind of fun and memorable.
Sure.
But this book definitely did get me started on really thinking about the connections between all the movies I was seeing. And it wasn't until this book that I definitely started to realize that I was only seeing movies by certain studios on TV. As I talked about a lot last week. PBS only had the back catalogs of RKO, Warner Brothers, and MGM. So any other studios that you were seeing, it was kind of an exceptional event, just a one-off acquisition by the TV station, or you were renting them. Some of them you could see on TV, like you could see some of the Cecil B. DeMille Paramounts at Easter or whatever, but those would be on network TV. There were ways to see some other studios' films, but the bulk of what I was seeing during my teen years, it was those three studios, and a dearth of the other ones, except for the big ones that were on home video.
There are many kinds of accidents of availability. Like, I remember just as my first period, as I'll now refer to it, of cinephilia.
You're talking like Mordden.
Yes, I am. He's going to be an influence on me now. During my first period of cinephilia, towards the end of it, so that would be the getting towards the late 90s and my mid-20s, people were just starting to talk about pre-codes. I didn't see a lot of them, but I started hearing the talk about them, and that's still a huge thing on the film social media circles. Why is that? Yeah, you gave me an account of that at one point.
Pre-codes?
Yeah, why did pre-codes become a thing only in the mid to late 90s?
I guess the short answer is that they became available again because people were starting to gain access to deeper cuts. They had not been showing on TV very much or at all because
I'm sure academics took the lead, as that usually happens.
Yeah.
That's why we still need humanities departments, even if it's not a lucrative field.
Because just think about it.
Doug Ford?
If a film violated the Legion of Decency standards, it also most likely violated TV broadcast standards.
What? No, a movie made in the early 30s violated the TV broadcast standards of the 1980s? That doesn't make sense.
Maybe not the 1980s, but certainly of the 50s and 60s when they started buying up movies to show on TV. So you just wouldn't show the story of Temple Drake on TV because you would get shut down.
I mean, yeah, some of the pre-codes are, well, they're risque in a very different way than movies are now.
Right.
We're going to be watching them, so we'll talk about them when we get there.
The first 4 years worth of studio age films that we're going to be talking about, and that's going to take us through many months, maybe years. Those are all pre-codes, technically, right? Because the idea, just so that we're all agreed on our terms, it's in pretty common usage now, but it doesn't actually mean what it seems to mean, because the production code came into effect at the end of the 20s, but
it wasn't enforced until the early 30s.
Yeah, the pre-code movies are basically 1930 to 1934, so they weren't pre-code at all. There was a code, it's just it wasn't being applied very much or at all until 1934 when the Catholic Legion of Decency threatened to organize a boycott of all Catholics in the United States, which would have meant like half of the urban population of the United States would have stopped going to films.
So we diverged. We were going to define a studio, and that reminds me of that because we need to talk about theater distribution.
Yes, so the Platonic idea of a studio is an integrated enterprise. So that means that they make the movies, And they also ship them out to theaters that they own. So...
And these material conditions created a certain kind of filmmaking that has not been seen since, all agree.
Absolutely, because if you own your own theaters and you know that there's never going to be a bottleneck, you know that if you make 10 movies in this period, all 10 of them, you're going to be able to get them shown because you have the screens.
It means you make a lot of movies with a lot of filler. It also means you can afford to take risks.
Absolutely, because you're making it up in volume and you're signing people to 7-year contracts and you want to have those people available. You don't want to just grab them when you need them.
As Mordden says, this also has to do with what is a mogul and why did these moguls, most of them Jewish children of immigrants, why did these moguls want to embark on these commercial enterprises that nevertheless they felt the need to also create prestige for themselves?
Yeah, a lot of it had to do with cultural insecurity, which is a very productive force.
Yes, if you don't feel any cultural insecurity and just don't think culture matters at all, you will
Make
be
Marvel
a
movies.
pure mercenary capitalist.
Yes, you'll be like Disney.
And you'll take no
right
risks,
now.
and you won't put any women in your movies because you have an idea in your head about what your target market is, and you're risking one-time investments of phenomenal amounts of money to get a return.
Ethan Mordden's got 6 studios. 5 majors, everyone agrees on, and they do fit basically the description of the Platonic idea of a studio. Then there's a 6th that is kind of halfway between a major and a minor, which is Universal. Universal has a gigantic production facility and puts out as many movies as the other big studios, but they do not own any theaters. So they...
yeah, I must have missed something in that final chapter because he kept talking about how they only played to second-run theaters.
Exactly. So the way movie distribution worked during this period was you're Warner Brothers, you're MGM, you make your movie, you send it out to all the prestigious urban center cinema palaces that have been built across America, except of course that each studio had areas in which they had strength and areas in which they had no theaters. Paramount was pretty much the only studio that had the whole country covered. The other studios were all kind of, like Warner Brothers was definitely bunched in the Northeast and Midwest. RKO was even more bunched only in the Northeast, and it could impact the kinds of movies you were going to make. Fox had more in rural areas, I think. However, when you get to really rural areas, these were all second-run cinemas. Now, the idea of second-run, so a first-run theater is a studio-owned theater that puts out the freshest movies by the studios. So if you live in New York City and you've got a Lowe's near you, then...
Is that now, why do you want that audience? Why does everyone want that audience? Just because of the population density? Are people in cities more likely to go to movies?
Yeah, well, there's just more of them, right? You can't really count on getting much of a draw, although you told us your family would drive an hour to go to the movie, if that's what you did if you had to, but you wouldn't go every day. Like some people actually did go to movies every day during this period, or several times a week. You couldn't really do that if you had to commute.
And yeah, a lot of the small towns where the population is spread out thinly in rural areas wouldn't have their own theater. You don't even get a theater until you get population density.
Exactly, and there were price differences. You would have to pay more to go to a first-run theater. So this was the newest MGM movie. Usually it would screen for a week and it would be gone, and the next week there'd be another one, because there was a production schedule to keep. So you only had a week to see movies, so you had to be on it. You had to go and see the movies every single week. And if you lived in downtown New York, you could go to an MGM theater, you could go to an RKO theater, you could go to a Warner Brothers theater probably, and see all these different movies. Then there would also be second-run theaters in New York City, as well as in the hinterlands, and these would be much cheaper. They would be slightly out-of-date movies. So let's say Forsaking All Others, a MGM movie from 1934, comes out. You see it first run, but then it doesn't just completely evaporate. It just isn't at the MGM theaters anymore. They've sucked all of the upfront interest in it out, and then they start renting it out to second-run theaters. The second-run theaters needed product as well.
It's comparable to the people who want to see, even this isn't comparable anymore, but it was at one time comparable to the people who want to see the movie in the theater versus the people who are going to wait for it to come out on video.
Absolutely. And Universal, because they had no theaters at all, they had to go straight to the second-run process. So
and that made them, according to Mordden, very unadventurous.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
So this is a time perhaps to get into the rankings.
Well, I just want to talk a little bit more about the other studios and, what counts and what doesn't and how Hollywood talked about these things, right?
All right.
So you had the 5 majors, which we'll be getting to shortly, but it's MGM, Paramount, Warner Brothers, RKO, and Fox. These were integrated. They had everything a studio was supposed to have. Universal had the giant factory, but no cinema presence. They had to rely on the kindness of second-run theaters to show their movies. Then you have Columbia, which was a major minor. They had no theaters and had a much smaller lot, but they were considered more prestigious than Poverty Row, right? So that's another. And then the third major minor was United Artists, which was basically like a startup created by Charlie Chaplin and Douglas
But it kept going for
Fairbanks
decades and decades.
Yeah, and the whole idea there was that this was where the artists would run the studio, and it wasn't really a studio so much. It was just a scheme, and it had a whole bunch of deals with different theaters to have their movies shown. Now, there were movie palaces that would show anything if you paid them enough. Columbia movies did have prestigious openings in downtown New York. They just had to pay through the nose to get that movie on the screen.
So they'd only do it for what Mordden calls a big one.
Yeah, for Frank Capra's movies.
Well, or things that were very popular. Yeah.
And then everything else they made were just quickies that they sent out to whatever.
Well, Capra was both, because It Happened One Night was very popular and also brought a lot of prestige.
Yeah. No, but like Radio City, that's a big one, right? So Bitter Tea of General Yan, Frank Capra's 1933 film, this is before he won a bunch of Oscars. It opened in Radio City Music Hall. But Columbia didn't own that theater. They probably didn't get much profit out of it. They had to sign away most of the percentage to the theater owner. Whereas MGM could have their movies shown in an equally prestigious place in New York City and keep all the profits.
And as Mordden talks about, sometimes for commercial reasons, but sometimes not. Like, you'd see one or the other, or a mixture of the two, with the different moguls wanting to compete with each other for prestige. So sometimes you would pay through the nose just so you could keep your studio being talked about by critics.
Exactly.
And by award bodies.
Right, which were, the people giving out the awards were stooges of the studios, but they were collective stooges of the studios, so there was a way to kind of force a little bit of prestige.
Yeah, I guess there was no New York, Los Angeles Critics Circle Awards at this point. What, was it just the industry? We don't know this.
Well, the Academy Awards were...
Yeah, the Academy Awards are very early.
Yeah, but Columbia, a total outsider to the big time, managed to win all of the major Oscars in 1934 because everyone acknowledged that Capra had done something so wonderful that they couldn't just keep giving it to an MGM movie. They had to let Columbia win one in this case, even though...
And that felt good to Columbia, even though that wasn't primarily what they were after or about.
It became more and more what they were about, which a nice thing about Mordden's book is that 90% of it is about the 6 studios, but he does have this little chapter on the independents, and he gives a pretty nice little description of what was going on at the most important ones. Columbia is the most important one, obviously, and it became a major force. It's still active now. Well, it's like Sony now, but...
The people who don't get talked about in the book are some of the biggest auteurs, such as Howard Hawks.
Well, he talks about some Howard Hawks movies. He's got Bringing Up Baby in there, but when they intersect with studio... Howard Hawks did make most of his movies for studios.
Yeah, but he was, what, a
ones.
freelancer, or he had his own production? He did have his own production company, didn't he?
Maybe at one point, but he was mostly just signing...
No, it's Ford and Capra who had their own production companies.
Yeah, well, Capra worked for Columbia straight up in the 30s. Then in the 40s...
A lot of the freelancing stars and directors would work for a long period under one studio and then, develop the power to move between them.
Yeah, well, the stars, the standard contract was 7 years, and once you got out of that, then you could...
If you had the power.
Exactly. Like Cary Grant. Here's an example.
Yeah.
He was at Paramount for 7 years. They signed him. He served out his time there, and he didn't really become a big star, but he did well enough. He was a recognizable enough name, and I guess he told his agent it was important to him to get him out of the contract and get him into some kind of a situation where he could work at several different places at once. So by the late 30s, you start to see Grant show up in a lot of, like, RKO, Columbia. He had little deals with all of them instead of a big ongoing 7-year contract.
And James Stewart when he gets back from the war?
Sure, yeah. James Stewart served out his time at MGM, and then Stewart is what everyone points to as a pioneer in terms of actors blitzing or running a power play on Hollywood, because he, in the 50s, and his agent created like a new way to apportion the profits. Like basically Jimmy Stewart got like 50% of the profits on all of his movies in the 50s. So he became immensely rich out of this.
And then there are stars, consistently popular stars, who were always freelancers. Barbara Stanwyck.
She started out under... Well,
you always have to start somewhere.
Yeah, I guess she was never on a 7-year deal, but she was at Columbia primarily at the beginning, because she's in all those Capra movies. Yeah. She is simultaneously doing some work at Warner Brothers in the early 30s as well. It'd be interesting to look into.
What I'm getting at is that the book is geared towards not only the directors, but even more so towards talking about the stars who were strongly associated with one or two studios. There are, of course, stars strongly associated with two studios who developed different personalities over time, like Joan Crawford.
Yeah.
Or who's the other? Katharine Hepburn.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this more as we get into the thick description, I think. But yes, one of the things that studios did that really isn't done so much anymore is that they really took the time to develop star personae, right?
Sure.
We still have stars, but we don't have stars that are made in the same way at all, and not with the same kind of...
Well, for women it's been disastrous, because certainly not all of the popular actresses of the studio era are the people that we remember today, but the people that we do remember today, the female stars have an idiosyncrasy. Like, somehow that type of development of star personas lent itself to the development of idiosyncrasy in a few actresses that it's really difficult to see anything comparable now, unless you get someone who just manages to really develop a reputation as an actor and work with a lot of auteurs, do a lot of independent films, and yet remain bankable. You get people with careers like Laura Dern, but I think they are rarer.
Yeah, and you just don't get to see people in the same variety and concentrated assault upon the imagination that you would get from
because
the 30s.
They made so many pictures.
Yeah, because Bette Davis is making like 7-8 movies a year in the 30s. So we've got all of this stuff to gorge upon now and to develop this multifarious view of what Bette Davis, what that star is, rather than a kind of prestigious Oscar outing every year for Meryl Streep or whatever.
And in a way, men almost have it worse, because although they are more bankable and movies are more geared towards them, the male stars, they're stuck in these lifeless fucking action pictures.
Well, everyone is now.
Yeah, I know. Women have to be like the action heroes and et cetera and et cetera.
Now, the more superheroine films we get...
And again, you have to be somebody who develops somehow on their own, like Leonardo DiCaprio manages to develop enough of a star persona, God knows what it is, but that auteurs want to work with him.
Yeah, interesting. That's enough of a preamble about studios in general.
We're going to move into part 2, where we can talk in more detail.
So what we've decided to do is go through the studios and talk about both what Mordden says about them and where we think there might be omissions or where we disagree just right on the basis of the text with what he's saying, where we find what he's saying insightful. And we're going to go through them in the order that Elise has decided she appreciates the the studios in, based on the information that has come into her through this book and through her life of movie watching.
Well, no, realizing that I've never actually thought about what studios did what before reading this book. So this is a kind of mock ranking that I've just developed so that Dave can bounce off of it.
So, Elise, based on this new information that you've just absorbed over the past few days, what is your favorite studio?
Well, over a month. I've been reading the book over the course of about a month.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite... No, I'm going to go in descending order.
Oh, your least favorite studio. Okay, let's start with that. Studio number 6.
So this is going to get us more into everything we've just been talking about. What is the identity of a studio and what is the cutoff point? Because I would rank either Universal or Fox in 6th place. I'm leaving out Columbia and the Independents.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, they're not going to be included in this discussion, although we'll have many occasions to talk about their films over the next few years, I'm sure.
So again, it would be either Fox or Universal in 6th place, depending on whether you include the Ross Hunter Universal unit as part of the identity of Universal Studio.
Well, he does, so I think you should.
Because it takes place...
in the 50s.
Overlapping the period when... What do you call that ruling?
The Paramount decision.
The Paramount decision, right.
So do you want to put Fox in 6th place then? Because Ross Hunter bumps up Universal?
Yeah, he doesn't for Mordden, but I tend to...
Yeah, of course.
I've been influenced by academic film criticism on Cirque, and Cirque is a big player for me.
Alright, well let's table that, because we'll get back to that. So we're starting with Fox.
Oh, and what I'm also going to do is I'm going to propose what is the big one of every studio, the film that it made that remains in the general, not just the cinephilic, but the general public consciousness, and you can argue with that if you want.
Okay.
So Fox... Fox then would be in 6th place.
Are you giving us the whole list now, or...?
No.
Okay, so...
It's going to be a surprise to you too, Dave.
Although
I don't know how surprised you'll actually be, but...
So Fox is last. So
Fox is last.
One thing I do want to mention is that Mordden, I think, makes no bones about the fact that he's got an order as well.
Yeah.
He presents them in the following order, and they're actually in descending number of pages. So he gives Paramount...
Yeah, and he seems to get more tired, the further he gets on in the book, and more impatient. Although kind of also more interesting.
So, Paramount's first, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Fox.
Do you really think he ranks Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer higher than Warner's? Not according to his descriptions, I don't think.
I think so. He gives a lot more pages to MGM.
Maybe that's just he thinks it's more historically important. Although, what's the distinction?
Okay, this is the order in the book. So, he's got Paramount, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Warner Brothers, Fox, RKO, Universal last. But you are going to Fox. So
Fox is last.
He ranks them above RKO and Universal.
I'm going to say that I had hardly seen a movie from Fox before I met you.
Right, and this is what I was talking about last week. You could not see Fox movies on TV unless it was a really special occasion. Now, I did see some. Like, I saw Laura on TV.
Well, everyone's seen Laura.
But the general catalog...
So that's one big feather in the Fox cap. They have the greatest Preminger noirs, the 3
right
40s noirs.
But let's not talk about that yet, let's talk about how Ethan Mordden characterizes Fox.
All right, do it the way you wish to do it.
Fox is unique out of all of these studios in that it completely changed its name even during the course of the period that Mordden is describing. It began just as Fox Pictures. William Fox. All the studios went bankrupt except for MGM in the early 30s. Most of them survived in some form, some with very different leadership in place at a certain point, others with no change. They just managed to make the right arrangements with bankers to keep going until they got out of the red. Fox just completely went down, and it got subsumed into 20th century, or merged with 20th century, and it became 20th Century Fox. It had a completely different logo. So if you watch a Fox movie from the early 30s, it's got one logo, and then it's completely different. It's the Star Wars Searchlight logo that everyone's familiar with now, although now it's just been taken over by Disney, so it finally doesn't exist anymore. But that's 100 years later, or whatever. If you read the Mordden chapter, though, he stresses continuities between Fox and 20th Century Fox.
Mm-hmm.
And he characterizes it as...
Well, this is the thing. This is the thing. So Mordden tries to get... He's not just talking about who were the individual influencers at different times at these studios. You know, the directors, the heads of production, the moguls. He also wants to talk about, and this is very problematic, just like talking about genres. He wants to characterize the flavor of every studio, despite the fact that there were all of these changes of personnel and this multiplicity of personnel at any given time, and that becomes difficult and possibly misleading.
Yes. So he boils down each studio to a chapter title.
It's also fun.
Yeah.
Like talking about genres.
That's what you do if you want to spark discussion.
Yes.
You overgeneralize so people can dive in and say where and quarrel with you. So he calls Fox the Rube, and he says the preponderance of its output is geared towards the Midwest and the rural audience, and it's backward looking. And
not as backward looking as Universal in his characterization, though.
But it's different. It's a rustic Americana.
Well, and the first place... Okay, so here's where he's getting some of this from. He's getting it from the fact that Murnau made Sunrise there. He has to skip over City Girl.
Yes.
And also mischaracterize Sunrise as being completely hostile to city values. Then there's early Borzage and John Ford's non-Westerns. And, of course, there is, in the early Fox period, Will Rogers.
Yes.
Will Rogers, you showed me.
State Fair.
And Steamboat Round the Bend, which was directed by Ford.
Yeah.
I loved both of those movies.
They're both incredible movies.
I think I might we're probably going to watch quite a few Will Rogerses as we make our way through the studio through the years.
Yeah.
What else does he use to get there?
After Will Rogers dies... Then you get the Zanuck era, the 20th Century Fox era, and what he stresses, what he focuses on are, again, these rural-focused pictures and the sort of Fox oleo musicals, which are purposefully less sophisticated than the RKO musicals and less slickerish than the Warner Brothers musicals. These are the Alice Faye,
and
Betty
Mordden
Grable.
Is very much a musical guy, and that really comes out when he talks. He has thick knowledge of the history of Broadway musicals.
Yes, well, after this book came out, he wrote a whole series of books on the Broadway musical during each decade, and I've got his books now, and I took them out of the library at some point in the past, the 20s one, the 30s one, he wrote one on the 40s, he just wrote them all the way up, so he knows more than anyone else, maybe, about Broadway. He's seen every Hollywood musical you can possibly see, I think, as well, so
Although he barely, he's interestingly perverse, because he barely talks about MGM musicals. He barely talks about the Free
we'll talk
unit.
about that when we get
Yeah. Anyway, what stands out for me, given the personalities at Fox that he talks about, people like Will Rogers, Alice Faye, Betty Grable, Shirley Temple, Carmen Miranda, all the way up to Marilyn Monroe, although he doesn't really get into her movies. It's these stars that are very much, you would assume, aimed at middle American rubes, aimed at people of lowest common denominator taste.
Yeah, normies.
Who are like big cartoon types, who don't have the sophisticated flavor of the stars that we most remember, even if they are just as ubiquitous, like Marilyn Monroe is the most ubiquitous star of all time, probably.
Sure.
To the extent that it is a sophisticated persona, it is outside of Fox. It is in things like Some Like It Hot.
Sure.
Made with Billy Wilder towards the end of the 50s. Not her early Fox persona, although there are auteurists, including Rosenbaum, who will argue for gentlemen prefer blondes. And also that has any to lose, pedigree.
Yeah.
So that is interesting about Fox. This is almost kind of kitschy Americana association. But I always have to put in a word for the early 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's favorite star of all time was Betty Grable. So maybe some sophisticates, and he was a very cultured man with a background in Viennese culture. Maybe the ultra sophisticates, as well as the rubes, were interested in the Fox personalities.
Sure, and Mordden...
Kind of like a Jerry Lewis thing.
You could say he's damning them with faint praise, but he does find a way to talk approvingly of the Grable musicals, and he's
no,
like...
he loves Grable.
Yeah,
Grable does nothing for me. You've now shown me... I liked Alice Faye.
Well, Alice Faye, I think, is a more talented performer all around.
And just a more interesting personality.
But yeah, Grable, I think, her movies are really fun to watch, and Mordden seems to agree.
They're not fun for me. They're not fun to watch. Except when all the...
Well, Carmen Miranda's in a lot of them.
Like, he talks about them as being these... They're kind of like commedia dell'arte, he doesn't use that term, reviews with... He actually insults them by talking about how there's no narrative through line, it's just a bit of shtick here and a bit of shtick there, some musical shtick, some comedy shtick. But that's exactly kind of what I do like about them, the fact that they have this review quality that's like variety theater.
Yeah, the Nicholas brothers are always welcome, and they show up in all these Fox movies. I mean, it's
definitely more primitive than, like, you know, Preston Sturges or the Freed Unit, or Vincente Minnelli, but...
Well, you can't really describe The Gang's All Here as primitive. It's one of the most avant-garde films any major studio... Well, the primitive
is avant-garde.
Okay. Busby Berkeley went completely mental. This was the apotheosis of Busby Berkeley. The Gang's All Here. He's got the lady in the Tutti Frutti hat. He's got, like, a finale where all the characters' heads come at you in, like, a crazy
God, which
vertigo.
Is that one?
The Gang's All Here.
Who's in it?
Alice Faye.
I don't remember that one.
You don't remember that one?
No, we watch a lot all together.
We'll watch that one again at some point.
Okay, so no, that's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the primitive aspect. I am talking about the Betty Grable review style musicals.
Yeah, where they just bring out all kinds of different supporting acts. And, well, I mean, Grable has a story, usually, involving they're almost always showbiz people, and they get into little scuffles or misunderstandings with each other, maybe over career versus family. John Payne is often around saying, you know, you're getting too independent, stop that, or whatever. And then they have little fights. But, okay, let's talk about what's not in the Mordden chapter on Fox.
Okay.
More than anything.
Besides Preminger, he barely mentions.
Preminger is a big part of it. Fox was one of the preeminent producers of noir in the 40s, and he does not mention that once.
Okay. Besides Preminger, who's there?
Well, Preminger made a huge number of noirs, right?
Including the big three for me, which is Laura, Fallen Angel, and... oh shit, what's the other one? Days of Kenyon. Not really a noir, but sort of a noir.
It is a noir. And Where the Sidewalk Ends.
Yeah, with Dan Andrews as well.
Other key Fox noirs that I can think of. Nightmare Alley. You've got The Dark Corner. You've got a whole range...
Oh, Nightmare Alley?
Yeah, you got a whole range of docu-noirs, which Fox basically pioneered, like Call Northside 777, Roadhouse.
Oh, Roadhouse! Is that Fox?
I could sit here all day and think of more noirs, but none of them are mentioned by Mordden.
Why?
Well, because it doesn't fit with the rube.
Do you honestly think that's why? Because with other studios, he talks about them having several different characters. In fact, Universal has so many different characters under him that I don't even know. He doesn't even seem to have a thesis.
Right. Well...
he's, like I say, he's running out of steam towards the end of the book.
No, because it's harder and harder to reduce them to one ethos, I think. That's the problem with these studios.
By the way, I'm just looking up images of the gangs all here to see if I could prompt my memory. Holy shit! What's happening? I don't remember this at all. This is like a bad acid trip.
Yeah, this is not...
You're sure we watched this?
Yes, we did. I love that movie.
I was probably doing shift work and half asleep, though you think that would make me remember it more. Okay, well, we'll have to go back to that at some point.
This is something that we're going to notice often with Mordden, but I think in Fox it's one of the most egregious examples. He is really cooking the books in order to stress his own preferred interpretation of what the Fox ethos is.
Yeah, but anybody can... why would he bother? Because anybody could read it and challenge him.
Yeah, well, no, I'm sure he's aware that anyone who wants to...
So I think all he'd have to do is tweak his thesis to say that Fox has two characters. One is Sunrise and one is City Girl.
Sure, he could have done that, but he didn't. He stressed Hollywood wags opinion where they called it 19th century Fox, right? Because of all these Ford vehicles that happened in the 19th century and all these other kind of, all this rural fare that was looking back to the
So Dave,
pre-modern US.
Would you then say that sometimes a studio is just a collection of whatever personalities happen to be there at the time?
Well, I think that's partly
that combined with the material circumstances with which the studio is working, whether they have theaters, how much money they have at their disposal, where the theaters are.
The thing is, I think he's right about the early Fox, but once Zanuck takes over, what Zanuck does is
And he talks about Zanuck taking over, but he doesn't really stress it.
Well, he does, Zanuck does continue that tradition of doing a lot of rural stuff, but
Zanuck is coming from Warner's, we should stress.
And I don't think it's any surprise
Early
that
Warners.
In the 40s, the studio that Zanuck now presides over starts doing all these noirs, because noir does seem to have always been kind of in the DNA of Warner Brothers. And especially those pre-code Warner Brothers, like those are all kind of pre-noirs, you know, I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, that stuff, that's all Zanuck. And it makes sense that he would go back to that mode in the 40s, especially since it was popular as well. These crime melodramas were big in Hollywood at that time, and Zanuck churned out all kinds of exemplary ones. Now, one thing that he does mention is, you know, Gentleman's Agreement, and the strain of protest film that you do get under Zanuck, that even includes stuff like The Grapes of Wrath, like,
right.
How Green Was My Valley to some extent. I mean, that's rural Wales, but it is proletarian, and it's about people being abused by the coal industry, so...
Yeah, he does talk about every now and then the Warners, Zanuck will come out, but in general, no.
Exactly.
In general, no, the Fox ethos prevails.
And that's because he's stressing what was most popular, but even then, like, you know, he talks about Tyrone Power, he really makes it seem like Tyrone Power only did 19th century swashbucklers, but Tyrone Power also did Nightmare Alley.
Yeah.
He also did a bunch of other noirish adventure stories. He also did The Razor's Edge. It's kind of the height of sophistication for 1946. You don't get a lot of Midwesterners saying that life in America and the rat race is hell and I'm going off to Tibet to gain enlightenment.
Well, you know, there is that Eat, Pray, Love. But, no, that's more of an upper middle class liberal thing.
What's your idea of the quintessential Fox?
Oh, Jesus.
Movie.
Well, no, it's not about quintessential. It's just the one that stayed in the public consciousness as much.
So you picked one for each studio, then.
I did. You've just made it much harder, because it's more like you'd have to pick one for each era.
We're going the way Mordden is going, which
I don't think I can do it for Fox, because I was going to say Sunrise, but actually no, that's not in a public consciousness anymore, because the public has no consciousness of silent film unless it's Charlie Chaplin. I'd almost have to go for Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. But I don't know, I personally don't want to argue for that as a great movie, but many have. What would you pick? Fox is hard.
If I had to pick the movie that probably
stayed in the public
has had the most cultural staying power, it might be something like The Grapes of Wrath, right? Because
I've never even seen The Grapes of Wrath.
No, it is a really good movie. It's John Ford, based on, obviously, a book that...
I've been avoiding that movie for years.
No, it's very good. And people know it because they know the book. Most people in the U.S. still
I avoided
read
the
that
book in high school.
Yeah.
And then I avoided the movie.
That would be my pick. But certainly for Mordden, he uses Sunrise as the text that he's working off of. And it is, as you say, a kind of perverse reading of Sunrise as only an ode to rural values. I think Sunrise is so much more complex than that.
Yeah, the city is dark and evil, and Janet Gaynor can't get anything from the city when she eventually goes.
Yeah, that's ridiculous, because the city is... Certainly, the movie posits that the city is the cause of the trouble in the marriage, or a major symptom because of the vamp showing up and summoning...
Really, they just need a little bit of city in their marriage.
Exactly. It's the disease and the cure. So
and then
the
also,
marriage falls apart, or to the point where he's planning to kill her, but then they go to the city and they have fun there, and they rediscover their love for each other. And they wouldn't have done that without going to the city either. So you need the city.
Mordden also bases his idea of how Fox sees rural life on a perverse on Sunrise, right? But then if you look at City Girl, rural life is horrible. It's like a hair's breadth away from a lynching.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's how Murnau felt about rural America. Maybe he thought there was poetry in it, but this is not a guy that...
Well, there's some running through a wheat field that looks really nice.
Sure, it's beautiful, but there are also a lot of problems there, a lot of fascism lurking there, and I don't think Murnau would have been too keen on that. I think,
and misogyny is what he's most focused on in that movie.
Yes. Patriarchy with a capital P.
I don't know how to rank Fox. Fox is a pretty good studio, so if that's like the worst, then the studios are doing well.
Yeah, like my opinion is that all these studios are magnificent. I love so much of what they did. Now, at the end, I'll give a ranking just for fun of the 6, but let us continue. I guess that's Fox. Do we have any last words to say about Fox, or what? Who did you get any... What was the most surprising thing that you learned about Fox from the book? Like, in terms of facts, like what they made and what they didn't
I didn't
make?
know any of it. I knew about the musicals because you kept calling them the Fox musicals.
Right.
But I didn't know they had Murnau. I didn't know they were responsible for those 2 movies. I didn't know Early Borzage was there. I didn't know Ford was based there. I had no idea.
Okay.
And that's going to be, until you get to the big 3, that's going to be my words about everything.
On to Universal.
Universal, commonly known, and it is what he emphasizes as the horror studio.
He calls them the old monster.
So they were the oldest studio, he says, and the studio that survived as such the longest as well.
And they're
because they didn't have their theaters.
Right. So they're a throwback to an era, like they come from the Nickelodeon era, basically. And Carl Laemmle, who was the mogul of that studio, he called it the IMP, the Independent Motion Picture Company. And he was one of the leaders of the exodus to California to get away from Thomas Edison's patent thugs. Universal, they were the ones that had Florence Lawrence.
Florence Lawrence.
Yeah, at the beginning there, they actually were the first studio to put a star's name on the screen, and he does talk about that a little bit. The idea of, like, total anonymity in picture icons before that. You would just call someone, like, the Biograph Girl, and that was it. They had no identity beyond that. They were a complete creation of the studio. And under Universal, they start to differentiate that a little bit and give some agency to their stars, which was good and bad. Like, it made people even more interested in them, but it also made stars demand higher and higher salaries, which caused fits for moguls who were trying to keep to a budget. And Laemmle, he really psychologizes Carl Laemmle in that. It's more a chapter on an old man who doesn't want to change rather than anything else.
Well, the implicit psychologizing seems to be the idea that precisely because this was one of the first studios, it gets stuck in the past.
Yeah, and they have no theater chains of their own, so they're stuck with the preferences of the second-run rubes.
It does appear to be the case. Like, I just talked about the particular character of the Fox stars, who are kind of more like novelty acts than what we think of as a Hollywood star. But Universal, other than its horror, other than Karloff and Lugosi, really does seem to not have any stars up until
Deanna Durbin.
Well, and then the real kitsch of Deanna Durbin and Abbott and Costello.
No, Deanna Durbin is wonderful.
Oh, my lord.
I hate Abbott and Costello, though.
Most people do. Most thinking people do. Until you get to the exact point where most of the other studios are no longer acting as studios, where suddenly the Ross Hunter production unit appears, and they start remaking all of the women's pictures with this weirdo Douglas Sirk and major stars.
Yes, and James Stewart settles there in the 50s with his special deal with massive profit sharing for him. Yeah,
but is it
Universal becomes so much grander than it had ever been.
But
in
is
the
it
50s.
Still functioning as a studio under the old studio definition?
It kind of is, right? Because they do have contract players. They've got, he mentions, Piper Laurie, Tony Curtis. Like, they did cycles of movies with those people.
Doris Day.
Exactly. Doris Day
that was part
and
of the
Rock
Ross
Hudson.
Hunter production unit.
Yeah, so they last the longest as a studio, as a real functioning studio. So it's kind of interesting. I have problems all over the place with the way he characterizes the studio. I think it's kind of a travesty. But again, he doesn't know how to organize it because the studio has so many different
personalities.
Right, but I think he gets wrong the Laemmle era, especially the Laemmle Jr. era, which he doesn't really even...
And he's all over the place on James Whale. He seems to appreciate his horror efforts, but not anything else.
Well, he loves Showboat, but he doesn't seem to give credit.
Love Whale.
He doesn't give Whale any credit for Showboat, which is crazy. Now,
and he doesn't mention Waterloo Bridge, although he does talk about May Clark, who's in James Whale's Waterloo Bridge.
Yes.
But just as a talent that they allowed to get away, although she only gets away to become kind of the punching bag of James Cagney. That's the only way she's remembered in film history now.
Yeah, May Clark had a very... it's just distressing because she's so good in those early 30s movies and she gets lost track of so quickly.
Because of a little bit of improv from James Cagney, she rises to notoriety but can't ever shake that characterization.
Right, but I mean, there are other things, right? She was going through personal difficulties. She was institutionalized against her will, apparently, for a long period of time in the 30s, so...
Dave knows all about the tragic early 30s actresses.
So, this promising beginning...
That's what his last novel's about.
It really fizzles out. Well, my novel, a lot of it is set precisely in Universal during the Carl Laemmle Jr.
Alright, so talk
period.
to us about this period, because you bring up Laemmle all the time.
Laemmle Jr.
Yeah, sorry.
So,
he has even more contempt for than he does for Laemmle.
He doesn't even talk about him, really. And I think that that's insane. The way he wants to characterize Universal is as institutionally conservative. So Fox is a rube in the sense that their ethos, their grand themes all involve looking back to 19th century America. And Laemmle's Universal for Mordden is backward looking towards 1912. When the first studios were getting underway, and that it doesn't want to change from that way of producing movies. That's how he characterizes it. But then if you really look at what was going on, and he tries to find ways to make it seem like, oh, of course the backward studio would do this because it was behind the times, and it's so behind the times that it's new and
like
exciting.
Showboat.
Like Showboat. I find that really unpersuasive. Also horror, he tries to make it seem like, well, this is what a backward studio would do. It would make horror movies. I don't see
They wouldn't make horror movies like The Bride of Frankenstein.
No.
That is fucking avant-garde.
Exactly. And Laemmle Jr., All Quiet on the Western Front, I don't really see... The only thing that he's...
Oh yeah, he talks about the sentimentalization that takes place of the novel?
Yeah, it's very bizarre. Very bizarre. One thing that he does say is that...
That's one of the most affecting movie endings of all time, to reduce that to sentimentalization?
Yeah, it's wrong. But he does say that Universal was still making silent versions of its talkies.
Actually, that's
longer.
One of the most depressing movie endings of all time, too.
It is.
That's not sentimental.
Yeah, I mean, it's just wrong. But one thing that is true is that they were still making silent versions of their sound films in 1930, which no other studio was still doing. And the reason they were doing that is because they were distributing their films to a lot of theaters that didn't have sound technology yet.
Yeah.
We, at the TIFF Lightbox, saw the silent version of All Quiet on the Western Front last year.
Which was just as affecting as
we weren't even
any other
expecting
version
it.
could
I thought
be.
we were going to see the sound version, which I had seen before, but we saw the silent version instead.
It was great.
It was just as great.
Well, there's a part talkie. There were sound effects, and there were, there were sound effects. There was a soundtrack.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone spoke dialogue, but you could hear crowd noises and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Built-in soundtrack.
Fine, if he wants to argue that Universal was still catering to that market longer than anyone else, that...
Speaking of avant-garde horror, he has no respect for Ulmer, but the Black Cat gets thrown in there with the Raven, like they're the same thing.
Yeah, he hates Edgar Ulmer. He actually derides him on a couple of occasions. So he's not down with that auteurist trope at all either.
And he derides, of course, Cirque, which is
heresy. But
and Stoll.
Let's do this era by era.
Oh, fine.
I find that the Laemmle Jr. period was characterized by absolute recklessness. Which is just
that
bracing.
Makes more sense for accounting for all of these films we've just discussed.
Yeah, it's bracing to see it. Now, it's not only that. All the Whale films, he does mention that Whale's career got... Well, that's later. So
Siodmak.
Let's wait for that. Now, 1930 to 1936 is the Laemmle Jr. period, and during that period, they were just doing all kinds of amazing, weird things that no other studio was doing. You know, you've got Little Man, What Now? You've got these Borzage movies that are anti-Nazi, right as the Nazis were taking over, like right at the beginning. Like, no other studio was doing this stuff. None of this is backward-looking in any way. All the whale movies challenge all kinds of American pieties, and they're not playing it safe whatsoever. And the proof of that is that, like, I can't believe that he doesn't even really mention what led to the Laemmles losing control of the studio, which is that Laemmle Jr. went for broke on everything. And Showboat is what destroyed the Laemmle regime at
Right, he talks about Whale being driven out of the business, but he doesn't specifically describe how that happened.
No, he doesn't, because it wouldn't serve his interests, because they weren't playing...
He made it sound like somebody found out James Whale was gay and wrote him out on a rail, but that's not what happened.
That's not what happened. What happened was Laemmle Jr., I mean, he was a kid making the best possible use of nepotism, getting to be the head of a studio in his 20s, earnestly trying to
this novel is kind
do
of,
something with that opportunity.
It's kind of fan fiction in many ways. Hypocritic Days of yours, a fan fiction about various Hollywood studio-era characters.
Yeah. So the idea is that Universal was alone out of these big studios. It was a family business. They did not have bankers. This is why they didn't have a studio chain, because they didn't have that kind of multi-million-dollar funding to fall back on. So they just churned out movies and sent them to whoever would play them. And it was it was a big, sprawling operation, but one family controlled it. They didn't have to have a board or anything. It wasn't incorporated in that way. It wasn't a public company. So they didn't have to answer to anyone else that wasn't actually on site. Like all the other studios had to do that. Usually, there was someone in Hollywood and there was someone in New York running interference with the shareholders at the other studios, because you needed to be this big conglomerate to run a studio that had this big theater chain as well. So the Laemmles, or Laemmle Jr., like Carl Laemmle Sr., fine, I'm ready to accept his characterization of him, but he was not running the studio in the 30s. Laemmle Jr. bet everything, really, on the fact that James Whale would create an amazing version of Showboat and would get it done in time for them to release it and start reaping the box office rewards so they could pay off the people they had borrowed money from to make the movie.
And no, isn't it kind of interesting that this is the studio that starts off by notoriously firing von Stroheim for going insanely over budget and shooting too much footage when Thalberg was in charge, and then the same thing happens with Showboat.
Yeah, and we see the very real impact of this. Of course, in the Depression, it was harder to bounce back from something like that, and they really did have a gun to their head. It was like, you know, if you don't have the money by this time, you don't have the studio anymore. And everyone knew it, and Showboat, because it was a very big enterprise, it just took a little too long, and that was it. They lost the studio, and then it came out, it made all the money that they hoped it would make, but it made it for a bunch of faceless bankers. The Laemmles were out, never came back. Laemmles had nothing to do with the studio after 1936,
wow.
So everything that he's saying about Carl Laemmle and Universal being conservative because of Carl Laemmle Sr. makes no sense, because for most of the time that he's talking about, it's bankers who are making these conservative decisions.
So the banker era gives us Deanna Durbin and Abbott and Costello?
Yes. Yeah, and...
whatever you think of those film personalities?
Yes. James Whale, everyone knew he was gay, and the Laemmles
and also the
were protecting
shitty
him.
horror movies.
Yeah.
The post-Whale shitty horror movies.
Exactly, and he does talk about how these were inferior. This was an inferior cycle, the second wave of horror movies. They
even team up with Abbott and Costello.
Well, yeah, that's like the third wave.
But then there's a comeback.
Yeah, in the 50s. And, I mean, that Laemmle Jr. era is also the Stahl era.
Yes, before we get there, let's talk about how he characterizes John Stahl and the Imitation of Life's plural.
Yeah, I mean, he hates both of them, especially Cirque.
No, he's okay with Stahl's Imitation of Life.
Well, he thinks Stahl is still kind of boring, but competent, and he thinks Cirque is
I have never heard anyone else. Now, admittedly, I have neither. Jenny Gerhardt is one of the drivers I have not read, and I have not seen the film based on it, but I have never heard anyone prefer Jenny Gerhardt to Backstreet.
Well, it is a good movie, Jenny Gerhardt, but no, I mean, I'm a big fan of John Stahl. We're definitely going to do a show on him. We've got a book on him that I want to read that just came out last year, so that'll give us a pretext for doing a special spotlight episode on Stahl.
And we're not really culturally placed to talk about Stahl's imitation of life, but it is very politically prescient for a so-called weepy melodrama. And in its way more so than the avant-garde and stunningly affecting Cirque version.
Both are magnificent films, but they do completely different things. You know, I wouldn't want to have to choose between them. I think they're both 5-star brilliant films. I mean, it is shocking to see Mordden. Now, he's really bucking the trend by the late 80s.
To dismiss all Cirques.
Yeah, because Cirque was...
Well, he's obviously annoyed by the trend.
Yeah, he hates it. Which
is fair, but he doesn't really... He's not really... I mean, everything he says against Cirque has been addressed by the same critics. He's making himself out to be less sophisticated than he is to talk this way about imitation of life. And Lana Turner's acting inability, as though he can't understand what Cirque himself said about what he was doing in films like that.
Yeah, I mean, he nods to it. He's like, is this just all a critique of melodrama tropes? No, well, why did he make so many then?
Because Ross Hunter made him make these movies. They're a very bizarre accident of history that Cirque was being forced to work in a genre that he had no sympathy for, but he had to find a way to make art out of it.
And he did.
And so he did.
They're magnificent. One thing that Mordden's book can't do, does not give itself the space to do, even if he was capable of it, is engage in really good new critical readings of films. It's too much, the pace is too breakneck, so he just throws off stuff, and a lot of it is very suggestive and interesting, but when he wants to convince you of something that you do not agree with, it's not going to work, because he doesn't take the time to lay out an argument. He just throws off.
That said, compared to that other book on the Hollywood studios out there, which is sheer dry academic prose, I mean, at least Mordden has an engaging personality.
Yeah, I had both of the books. I still have both of the books, but you could see that my Thomas Schatz, The Genius of the System, is not falling apart, because I read it. I read it once, and then I refer to it. It's got a lot of good factual information in it, but
I couldn't read it.
It's only interesting if you want to read...
I think I bought it.
Yeah, if you want to read about studio budgets and how all of that sifted through...
You're right. It's good that someone wrote a book like that, but I don't need to read it.
No, of course. It's not the kind of book that you're going to just read over and over again for pleasure. And I've read Mordden many times for pleasure because I just find his writing so much fun. And I disagree with most of his strong judgments on films. It's really not about agreeing. One thing, though, that's in the Universal chapter that did springboard all my thinking about the novel, actually, you know, in terms of the Hollywood setting, was this idea that Universal failed to develop a bankable, run-of-the-mill musical genre during the Carl Laemmle Jr. era, which is true. And so my book, a lot of it, was about what would have happened if they had done that. They probably wouldn't have gone bankrupt in 1936, and maybe all of American history would have been different. That's the idea, right? Because one of the characters in my book is a kind of musical acteur who I slide into that spot in Universal's history so that they're making all this money off of those musicals so that they're not in quite such dire straits when they come to make Showboat.
So this is intensely personal to Dave.
It is.
Alright, so that's number 6 and number 5.
So what is Universal's most typical film in your view?
Oh, that was one that I couldn't. Okay, but based on, I really like your take on Universal. That's a way to characterize the studio that makes sense of all of these individual films that he rattles off, or to characterize one period of the studio, but I think, again, you would have to choose This is one where, if you're going by what stayed in the public consciousness, it has to be Frankenstein. Obviously, the Karloff interpretation, the Karloff makeup.
It has proven more enduring than Dracula.
And it is a great movie. It's a brilliant movie.
Yeah. I mean, I think Dracula is a great movie too, but we'll talk about that in our Halloween episode. And not so many people agree with that these days, so...
Well, he doesn't even agree with it.
No, he doesn't.
He goes on and on about the Invisible Man, though.
I love the Invisible Man.
Should we revisit it? I've only seen it once.
It's great.
It's got Claude Rains' voice in it.
I mean, James Whale, he should have talked about him more. We got nothing on Waterloo Bridge. We got nothing on Impatient Maiden. We got nothing on...
Oh, Waterloo Bridge. I've only seen that once, but it was so great. We've got to watch it again for the series.
Whale was doing all kinds of great stuff, not only in the horror genre. So, and then it's all gone. And when the Laemmles are gone, Whale is gone, because there's nobody else that's going to protect him. He's out.
4th place, MGM.
Interesting. Okay.
MGM, a lot of indelible individual movies. The Philadelphia Story, The Shop Around the Corner, Meet Me in St. Louis, Singin' in the Rain, and of course the one, my pick, is The Wizard of Oz. For the one that stayed, that really belongs to them, because really Gone with the Wind belongs to Selznick.
Right.
Although they got their name on it by some machinations.
No, but they didn't make it. No, you can't be Gone with the Wind.
I don't know, how did they get their name on it? By loaning Clark Gable, or what? Huh? How'd that happen?
Selznick made Gone with the Wind, but he needed a distribution deal, and he could have gone through United Artists, but he also wanted Clark Gable.
So it did have to do with Clark Gable.
Okay, you can show it at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer theaters, Lowe's theaters, if you give me Clark Gable, and then we'll share the profits. So that's what they did.
They don't really have the directors, though, other than Cukor stays there forever, and which is kind of unusual for a director with a long career, actually, to not be a freelancer or to have his own...
Well, no, Cukor wasn't
memorable director,
He wasn't there all the time. I mean, Cukor is...
He was making movies elsewhere, you mean?
Yeah, he's at RKO for a lot of his career. He is making movies... You know, he made movies at Columbia. He's all over the place.
But he's there in the 40s, and he's there in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, making very popular movies.
Yeah, but he wasn't exclusively on... He was under exclusive contract, I think, maybe to RKO in the 30s, because he was mostly making movies at RKO that I can think of, like Little Women.
Camille.
Yeah,
Was he on loan for Camille?
He might have been, yeah. Because think about it. He made Little Women. He made Sylvia Scarlett. These are RKO movies.
Anyway,
I don't know his contractual status.
Neither do I. Mordden, I was just guessing at it. Mordden says that they are not the studio of directors, they are the studio of stars.
Yeah, and I think that that's fair, although I do think that some of MGM's directors are better than he gives them credit for, like Clarence Brown, I think, is a great director.
I haven't seen enough Clarence Brown movies to be able to tell that, or I haven't seen them frequently enough.
I mean, he really underrates Brown's contribution, I think, and of course...
No, but these aren't, except for Cukor, these aren't people, and even Cukor's status as an auteur is very in question. He's just kind of thought of as a competent director, as a classy director of actresses.
Well, I think Saris puts him pretty high up in his...
Does he?
Yeah, I think so. King Vidor was at MGM for the late 20s and early 30s, and Mordden does mention him, and he does mention that he's an exception. Whenever he talks about a movie that just doesn't make sense for the great Hollywood studios to have made, he goes back to The Crowd, so there's always that.
Yeah.
It's the most art for art's sake film in Hollywood history, according to Mordden.
But as far as directors go, all the really outstanding films are made by people who, well, in some cases, a lot of contributions are by directors who just show up and make a picture there.
Jack Conway.
Like Shop Around the Corner.
Sidney Franklin. Oh, you're talking about people on loan, or
or whatever you call it when it comes to directors, making a picture at a studio that's not their home studio, or as a freelance project, or just getting it distributed, if they're a producer, just getting it distributed through a studio. Minnelli's musicals are made...
It's all MGM.
But what about his melodramas? Who's he working for then, in the 50s?
MGM.
Still MGM. So then he doesn't talk about Minnelli, who's... probably the closest thing they actually do have to a house auteur.
Well, he does talk about Minnelli.
Barely. Even in terms of the musicals, he barely talks about Minnelli.
He talks about the ones from the 40s. He talks about Meet Me in St. Louis and The Pirate, and that's the era that he's most... And then
he gets really excited about The Pirate.
He loves The Pirate. Yeah.
So there's Minnelli, that he doesn't really go into. And then there's Crawford and Gable, who made some very interesting films together for stars, I don't find Garbo's movies that interesting.
Well,
so that's a problem.
Some of them are incredible, but again, the best ones, it's because of a collaboration with a director that is really worth something, like Mamoulian on Queen Christina.
Did he make it with MGM?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all the Clarence Brown Garbos, I think, are really good.
No, I'm just talking about why I'm ranking it.
Garbo with George Fitzmaurice
Crawford,
is not very interesting.
Crawford is more interesting she's good in certain pictures at MGM, and Harlow and Gable are another good couple, but Crawford is far more interesting at Warner's.
Well, Crawford I love everywhere, and Crawford made great movies at MGM, and again, some of them are Clarence Brown, like the first Possessed is an incredible movie.
So if you're going to make an argument... But this makes it sound like if you're going to make an argument for MGM, you have to start talking about directors who are not referenced as auteurs.
Yeah.
That's why he says it's not a director's studio.
Yeah,
he characterizes them all as workmen-like, the ones who are under contract.
Yeah, and the people he goes to, well, he does talk about Brown in that way, which I think is not right, but he talks about W.S. Van Dyke, which I think is correct. I mean, he is just an expert craftsman, you know? You've got Sidney Franklin, you've got Jack Conway. These guys presided over incredible movies, but it's hard to really know what they contributed to it. Like Tale of Two Cities, the Ronald Colman Tale of Two Cities is one of my favorite movies, and it was made by Jack Conway, who's like, who is that? He also made Libeled Lady, which is a great screwball comedy.
Who presided over A Tale of Two Cities? Thalberg?
No, see, this is Selznick.
Oh, Selznick, okay.
So, Selznick, before he went solo, he had a couple of gigs at the studios. He started at Paramount kind of in a low position.
Speaking of Thalberg, then there's Norma Shearer, who I can't get into at all.
Oh, I love Norma Shearer.
He loves actresses.
Norbert Lusk. There's a lot of stuff going on at MGM. In general, I think Mordden is right to focus on the star making. MGM's ethos is its stars. I think that that's right. I think that he is on the money there. Even though a lot of their greatest movies also need the contribution of an important director. A director who's important to me, but not all of them. He says it's a star studio, but also a producer studio, and those things go hand in hand. You need a producer who is really taking the time to think about and develop a star persona. And so he talks about Thalberg, he talks about Selznick, who didn't really make stars at MGM. He made a star out of Charles Dickens. Selznick had already been doing stuff like that at RKO, where he was working on literary properties there too. Selznick's responsible for Little Women at RKO. And then he leaves MGM after 1935 and creates his own studio with the aim of eventually making something like Gone with the Wind. But yeah, interesting aspects of this long sprawling MGM chapter. He really has it in for the Freed unit, which is...
He does. So that means that he doesn't talk about Gene Kelly, he slights Vincente Minnelli, he barely talks about Judy Garland.
Yeah, well, they're all in there, and he does throw out opinions.
But he really has it in for the post-Thalberg era. Briefly mentioned Thalberg because he's like the most talked about producer, like setting a particular tone for movies, or head of production in the history of the studio era.
Well, he is the Platonic idea of this...
Which Selznick takes over and turns into the producer as auteur.
Yeah, the artist as producer, which Mordden really is invested in. It's the whole point of the book.
But he even talks about moguls who aren't artists in any sense, setting a tone. But
still, somehow, they do have artistic ambitions, even if they wouldn't be able to express them, like Goldwyn.
Sounds very contentious what he has to say about Goldwyn and his comparisons to Selznick.
Yeah, I mean, I think Goldwyn
only has ersatz taste. Selznick has real taste. I'm like, I don't know about that.
Goldwyn made amazing movies, so
and
something
Selznick
was
had
going
pretty
right.
ersatz taste sometimes.
Something was going right there. This is all in the small studios chapter, so we're not really going to be touching on it that much, but we can't help deviating into some discussion of that, because he's got some of his strongest opinions in there.
Okay, but Thalberg.
So Thalberg started out at Universal in the early 20s, and he was in his 20s, working under Carl Laemmle Jr.
He fired Stroheim, we covered that.
Yeah, and then he got tired of the small-time attitude of Carl Laemmle Sr., which again, I agree with. Carl Laemmle Sr. definitely did want to hold off the march of progress and keep Hollywood running the way it had been running in the teens. But Carl Laemmle Jr. did not, so this is where Mordden's Universal chapter goes off the rails. Thalberg wanted to be involved in a more state-of-the-art studio, so he switches over to MGM when it is founded, basically, in 1925. It comes out of a merger between Metro Studio, the Goldwyn studio, which didn't have Goldwyn anymore, and Louis B. Mayer, who was just a guy that they thought could serve as the mogul for this new studio, and they put his name in there, MGM. And Thalberg is the production head. So Thalberg basically takes charge of supervising every movie that MGM makes, and what Louis B. Mayer does, I mean, he's involved in ideas about who you're gonna put on contract and that kind of thing, but mostly what he was doing while Thalberg was running the day-to-day production was fighting with the New York bosses, the New York money men. So Thalberg was the one that was making decisions about, we're going to make this movie, we're going to make this movie, and he can make decisions that Mordden really praises, like, let's make The Crowd just for prestige. We're going to lose money and it's going to be fine. We're making so much money on everything else.
Mm-hmm. So he invents the idea of, and therefore MGM invents the idea of the Hollywood movie as art as well as commercial enterprise. He doesn't, though. That's just how he's usually put in the film history books.
Well, he's the stand-in for that idea, yes.
Yeah, okay. When they bring over a European like Murnau, I mean, this idea is already in existence.
Of course. And it was a legend that was being built during his own time. He died tragically young. He overworked himself, had a heart attack in his 30s.
And compared to the avant-garde Universal, as we just described, or the avant-garde RKO that's about to be described, people do accuse Thalberg and MGM of being middlebrow.
Definitely. Yeah, they were playing it safer. I mean, not always, right? Like, in one of the other things that he mentions that Thalberg okayed mysteriously is Freaks, which no one can accuse of being...
middlebrow.
And he talks about, which is true, Louis B. Mayer had MGM's logo taken off that movie because it was so upsetting to him. He did not want to be associated with that movie. There's a pre-code movie for you that people were not seeing.
It's one that I even saw in the early 90s, Freaks.
Well, it was celebrated by then, but not at the time. Mordden begins his chapter on MGM with Grand Hotel, and he keeps going back to it, and he goes back to Grand Hotel kind of as the signature product of the studio system.
And it's pretty bad. It doesn't look good anymore.
I'm not a big fan of it, and one thing that I really take issue with...
And Crawford, as everyone says, Crawford's the best thing in it.
Oh, Crawford is incredible in that movie.
She's got the energy of the future about her.
Yeah. Nothing much else about it is great. I mean, the sets are great, too, certainly. But as a movie...
And that's by Edmund Goulding, who made much better movies.
Yeah, I hate what Mordden says about Edmund Goulding. He uses Edmund Goulding as an example of someone who has no talent. Maybe it doesn't come out in Grand Hotel, I agree with that. But Edmund Goulding is one of my personal favorite auteurs.
Doesn't he do better work at Warner's?
Amazing stuff at
Dark
Warner's.
Victory and plus some Errol Flynn movies.
Yeah, the Dawn Patrol.
Lots of Davis, lots of Flynn. Yeah,
White Banners. I love White Banners.
We're going to do White Banners. That's our little discovery for the series for sure, but it might take us years to get there.
You know, Goulding goes to Fox where he does stuff like Claudia, and he does The Razor's Edge, he does Nightmare Alley. I mean, this guy is
a big one.
Great.
This guy is great, and he can do all sorts of genres. And works with women, works with men, he can do it all.
But he's one of the best at creating a real sense of intimacy with the characters that he puts on screen. And I feel like Mordden just misses that or doesn't want to talk about it.
One of the problems with auteurism is that it makes a virtue of lack of versatility sometimes.
Yeah, it does, for sure.
Or at least it demonizes versatility. Maybe that's a better way to talk about it. Is that MGM?
Yeah, I mean, I guess other things that he talks about with MGM.
Well, okay, we briefly touched on this. When Thalberg is gone, the sophistication is gone, whatever MGM possessed of that, and we're just left with Mayer and his conservatism, giving us the Andy Hardy series.
Motherhood and Apple Pie is what he calls it.
Which, again, as with Deanna Durbin, Dave has a strong perverse affection for the Andy Hardy series.
I love Andy Hardy. I love Mickey and Judy musicals. I just like Mickey Rooney in general, and obviously Mordden does not. egregiously. Now, here's something, you can't really blame Mordden for this. He was watching these movies mostly on 16mm maybe, or 35mm in a special screening at like a Hollywood archive or something, so he couldn't easily go back to these things. It's not like me now, I've got all these discs that I can just consult anytime I want. But he goes on and on about the Hardy series, and he gets details really wrong, like, it's not Carville, Idaho, it's Carville, Indiana, which is a big difference. He says Carville, Idaho twice. It's not right. I mean, that's like 1,000
I've been
miles away.
rereading Wally Haskell's From Reverence to Rape, and you notice even in that plot's entire theories, and again, you can't fault them because they couldn't consult it.
They watched it once, they took some notes, and if they got something wrong, they couldn't go back and get it right.
Entire theories are being based on, like, plots that are wrong. Plots that have been remembered incorrectly.
Yeah.
And that's really important with genre movies, which Hollywood movies are, because, and also often European movies, melodramas, right? Because you will tend to remember it as being more typical than it is.
Yeah.
You will not remember the nuance.
No, you won't. And one of the movies that he savages the most is, or he takes as an example of what's wrong with Louis B. Mayer's vision, is The Human Comedy by Clarence Brown, the great Clarence Brown.
He really excoriates that.
Although he does make an exception for the incredible telegram scene. Nobody can say that's not a great scene, but I just think it's a great movie. And certainly Mordden thinks that this is an example of everything that's wrong with MGM after...
Although you yourself have no patience with Mayer, because it was your, like, on my Williams' Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde essay that I wrote for Brightwell Dark Room, you were the one who proposed to me that the interesting and bizarre differences between Mamoulian's pre-code movie and the MGM Mayer-era remake were due to Mayer's conservatism.
Mayer definitely is. You cannot argue. Politically, he was
conservative. As well as
conservative.
the fucked-up psychology of Spencer Tracy.
Yes. Mayer definitely was politically conservative, and MGM in general is a very conservative studio when you're talking about class politics. Certainly, it's the number one studio that you can contrast with Warner Brothers and say, what's the right-wing studio? What's the left-wing studio? Those are easy to place in opposition.
Although you and I have gotten into some arguments about particular MGM movies that you want to give kind of a flat, this is an example of conservatism reading to, and then I will come back at you with, I think it's more nuanced than that.
It's always more nuanced than that.
No, it's not always more nuanced than that.
Often
if the movie's interesting at all, it's more nuanced than that. Well, Wife vs. Secretary is the one that we debated about.
Yeah, and there's a lot to talk about. Now, other things that he touches on, he talks about Red Dust quite a bit. He talks about Tortilla Flat. These are Victor Fleming movies. He talks about Victor Fleming as one of the most typical MGM directors, just sort of gifted, but with no actual viewpoint of his own. I'm not sure if that's true either, but certainly he did preside over some incredible movies, as we've discovered over the years, right, Elise?
Like what?
Well, like Red Dust, like Tortilla Flat, I think is a great movie, despite its atrocious casting.
Red Dust is the Gable Harlow one?
Yeah, amazing movie.
Well, they did a few, though.
Yeah, he also did Bombshell, the Harlow Hollywood movie.
That's like a pre-code potboiler almost.
Magnificent.
Red Dust. But yeah, it's great. Actually, MGM in the pre-code era is delightfully tawdry.
Sure. I think
and Harlow emphasizes that side of the studio.
I think the Fleming movie that hit you hardest was Test Pilot, which is...
I loved that movie.
It's beautiful.
Raw.
Yeah.
Apparently Howard Hawks worked on it uncredited or something and objected to how he had to portray the pilot as the men in the movie as psychotic and corrected that in Only Angels Have Wings, but I preferred Test Pilot.
Test Pilot's better.
Better screenplay, better performances.
Yeah, we're committing a great sin here by saying Test Pilot is better than Only Angels Have Wings, but I stand by it. I'll fight anyone.
The performances are bonkers, and like the performances in the Hawks movie are way too sedate by those standards.
Well, they're just exactly what Hawks wanted, which is not always
Hawks is only bonkers in his comedy.
Yeah, number 3.
RKO.
All right, interesting.
He primarily characterizes RKO based on their target audience. So their target audience is where they had their theaters, which was primarily in
the Northeast.
The Northeast, mostly going for the metropolitan New York area.
Yes, he even calls them the New Yorker.
They are the studio that made Citizen Kane, which is brought up, and that basically, repeatedly, although this is the story we just told about Universal, repeatedly made avant-garde movies that tanked. Sylvia Scarlett being another prime example. Well, Citizen Kane didn't tank. Ultimately, Orson Welles tanked.
Citizen Kane did not do well, because a lot
Did it really not?
No, most theaters didn't play it.
Critics immediately loved it.
Yeah.
Oh, right, but that's because of Randolph Hearst.
Sure, but whatever reason, it didn't make money.
Right, but they braved, that's what he's talking about, the, who's the head of production for that?
Well, that was Schaefer at that time, so...
But they braved the power of William Randolph Hearst in order to make this movie.
Yeah, RKO is another one that has several eras, right? So there's the Pandro S. Berman era.
Well, there's the Selznick, and then the Berman, and then the Dory Sherry.
Well, and in between there's Schaefer.
And then there's Schaefer with Wells.
And then it all gets destroyed when Howard Hughes takes over, and
he just crushes it like King Kong, picking up Toy Studio and crushing it in his paw.
Rough. Alright, what were you saying about RKO?
Was I saying something about RKO? Val Lewton.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about the heads of production, but the other major players are Hepburn, Rogers and Astaire, Val Lewton, and Wells.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And in the late 40s, very distinctive leftist noir under Dory Sherry, with Edward Dmytryk being the most prominent of the directors responsible for stuff like Crossfire.
Yeah, and he talks about that. So, did you really find anything to debate in his characterization of RKO? It seemed to cover the bases.
No, I think he's got a good beat on what's going on at RKO. He does cover all the eras. Unlike in some of the other chapters, he doesn't perform any sleight of hand to make it seem like it's consistent through that time. He does say, look, there's this era, there's this era. But
that's because he can find a common thread in his sophisticate.
Right, because no matter what era, they're always aiming for the same audience and missing out on pleasing everyone else. and
often missing out on pleasing even that audience.
In some cases, yeah. But what he does say is that they're more famous now for the movies that didn't work out than the ones that did.
Other than Citizen Kane, their most famous product is Bringing Up Baby, which tanked at the time as well.
Yeah, but of course, if I was arguing, I think the movie that has stayed in the popular consciousness the most that RKO made is almost certainly King Kong.
Does anybody watch that movie anymore, though? Because people certainly watch Bringing Up Baby and Citizen Kane.
When I was a kid,
yeah, but
the only
Dave,
old movie...
You're old.
Yeah, but
I'm asking about people now watching King Kong.
One of the only old movies that people still watch is King Kong. More than Citizen Kane, if you're talking about non-cinephiles.
I don't think I ever saw it as a kid. I saw the Japanese Godzilla versus King Kong movies on TV, but I don't know about Fay Wray's King Kong.
I think that movie is still seen quite a lot. There's room for debate, but that one doesn't fit really with that thesis because it was a huge hit at the time. It was what kept RKO rolling through the rocky times of the early Great Depression.
He does find a way to make it fit into his sophisticate idea, though. His Kong heads straight for New York and starts climbing the Empire State.
You can read Kong as an essay in post-colonial theory. I mean, you can read it the reverse way as a disgusting imperialist narrative as well. I think it's probably both of those things.
Well, he is a tragic figure.
He is.
He cannot survive in the New York metropolitan.
And Mordden does talk about Son of Kong, which is more explicitly post-colonialist, because it's like a big apology tour, an attempt to make it up to Kong's son.
One thing he was really interesting on was... I had, because I came to Gene Kelly as one of my earliest old movie affections, I was on the Gene Kelly side of the Kelly versus Astaire, and I'd never really understood until we get into Mordden's detailed knowledge of Broadway, early 20th century Broadway theater, what made Astaire an innovative dancer. And he really illuminated that for me.
Yeah, there's a good,
And talking about how he was one of the first to start choreographing himself, and also the innovation of the RKO Astaire Rogers musical being that it combined song and dance and then brought both into the narrative.
Yeah, I like Gene Kelly a lot, but I certainly like Astaire more. If I had to pick, I don't see why you would have to, but...
Well, I can't change my first affection.
No, why should you? He does set up little things, like he's subtweeting in this book quite often, right? So he's taking issue with, he even psychologizes it lightly. Worship of the freed unit that was prominent in literature.
Well, we both agree
80s.
that we're not crazy about the bandwagon, which we rewatched recently.
Yeah, but I am crazy about Meet Me in St. Louis, even more maybe about Yolanda and the Thief, which gets short shrift from Mordden.
And he agrees with my 12-year-old self that Brigadoon is garbage, but we rewatched it recently and thought
amazing.
It was brilliant.
Yeah.
And gorgeous.
Yeah, I think Brigadoon's better than The Bandwagon.
And The Pirate.
Yeah, The Pirate is a good movie. I mean, most of these are good movies. And Singin' in the Rain is the most celebrated product of the freed unit. And Mordden is saying, sure, whatever, those are fine, but RKO's Astaire Rogers movies are so much greater.
But that's very, very contentious.
Yeah.
Because they're not better as movies. They're not.
Well, I think they are. But I think they're magnificent films, and
they're very perfunctory little basic stage comedies with song and dance routines interpolated.
No, they're beautifully done movies. You've even got, I mean, the one that people always point to because it's got an auteur on it is Swing Time, and I can see the argument for making that your...
What, Stevens?
Yeah, George Stevens.
Did he only make Swing Time?
Yeah, the others were made mostly by Mark Sandrich. There's also...
I think I like The Gay Divorcee the best.
That's Mark Sandrich. I like Roberta a lot more than I guess most people do. That's, I think, William Sider. But it's a great movie.
What was I talking about stage comedy? That's not what I meant. Many of them aren't set up like stage comedies. They're farces. They're very, very basic farce plots.
With perfect farce performers.
Yeah.
Edward Everett Horton, Eric Blore, Alice Brady, wonderful performers for that genre. And Astaire and Rogers are, I could watch those movies over and over and over again.
Like I said, I grew up with Gene Kelly, Oscar Levant, and whoever else got brought into that.
Sure.
Brought into the various different mixes. But I do appreciate...
Those are really great movies, too.
I do appreciate these other performers you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
What about the real weirdo? The real weird little bald guy?
Eric Blore.
No, not Eric Blore, the even weirder one. I think he is in Swing Time.
Oh, Victor Moore?
Yes, the little demoniacal guy who just creates havoc during the whole movie.
But he's his friend, his best friend.
I know, but he's evil. He's a force of evil.
Well, he's got a little bit of imp in him.
Stevens is do you think Stevens is considered, well, I guess for his 50s work, he's considered an auteur.
No, people love Stevens. They also love his 30s. And
Isn't he one of the people that Manny Farber attacks for having switched from termite art to white elephant art?
He's the textbook example of that, yeah. So Manny Farber was vaunting
I actually like both of Stevens' periods. We saw Giant.
Giant is really good. Now, the greatest story ever told is not good.
No, it was Giant that we saw, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, but that is a white elephant movie that Stevens made that is very good. Very big canvas melodrama.
The greatest story ever told is a white elephant. Story of Anne Frank probably also falls into that category.
Well, how can he be an auteur when he was making all of these bloated garbage movies?
Well, that's at the end of his career.
Well, but if you're an auteurist, they all have to be great.
No, they don't.
They all have to make sense.
Frenzy is not great.
They all have to make sense. Well, that one makes sense, unfortunately. We're diverging here. Yeah. We don't need to talk about Stevens forever.
Stevens at RKO is, Alice Adams is his greatest film, probably.
Well, and Mordden agrees with that.
It's just peak Hepburn, one of the best things that RKO ever made. I would probably like it more than Citizen Kane, although I love Citizen Kane. And yeah, I think he's right to focus on that. Here is where we do get some discussion here about the difference between the RKO Hepburn and the MGM Hepburn, which I think we may have even talked about. We probably never have talked about it on the podcast before because we've never had an opportunity opportunity to do so.
There was a partial Hepburn retrospective recently at TIFF.
We did talk about Christopher Strong in the Dorothy Arzner episode, and I'm sure we did at least mention the differences there, like what happens to Hepburn after she leaves RKO. Pandro S. Berman was protecting her.
One of the avant-gardists who tanked at RKO because of the freedom they were given. This will be a story, again, when we talk about Paramount. Katharine Hepburn. You say she was backed by Pandro S. Berman, but he had his limits. After she made so many failed pictures, including some that are considered among her greatest now, like Bringing Up Baby, but then she made Sylvia Scarlett.
Well, Sylvia Scarlett was before Bringing Up Baby.
Was it? So it was Bringing Up Baby that was the last? But so Mordden talks about how he said he'd never work with him again, but then he did on Bringing Up Baby, and then that tanked?
Yeah, well, he may not have worked with them that closely, because when Howard Hawks came in, he was kind of the producer as well.
Ah, okay.
Berman...
But it's the same team.
Yeah.
Hepburn and Grant again.
Yeah, I mean, Grant did a lot of RKO movies. But yeah, Sylvia Scarlett was, I think, the end of Pandro Berman's...
And Howard Hawks thought this was a good idea after Sylvia Scarlett? Or okay, we don't know the exact timing of everything
well,
here.
Stage Door comes in between those, right?
Ah.
So Stage Door was a hit, but that's probably mostly, in terms of the public, it was because it's a great Ginger Rogers movie.
And already you get an experiment in that one with kind of shaming Katharine Hepburn as in order to recoup her as a personality that Middle America will like.
A little bit, but she is
well,
also...
she's playing a caricature of herself. And she has to come to learn to be accepted by the girls and learn a lesson about common people or whatever.
Sure, but the movie
It's
is
a great
also
movie.
in awe of her in a way that I think that Tracy
Well, Woman of the
movies
Year
aren't.
is in awe of her until Stevens just decides he's going to agree with Hepburn's plan for her persona and completely throw her character under the bus for a section of the movie that makes no sense.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't
That's
think...
MGM Hepburn.
Yeah, I don't think Stage Door does that. I think that it's more organic.
No, not at
her
all.
learning
well, that's
process.
why it's a much better movie.
Yeah, one of the greatest movies ever made as
And
well.
why I don't know about Stevens actually being an auteur. I think he bent to whatever material he was given. He was just very, very gifted.
Stevens is very gifted in the presentation of the erotic, as you have written about with
in
your
comedy.
Vivacious
well, not
Lady.
just comedy. It plays in The Sun as well.
Yeah. No, I think he's one of the best at that. And you get, like, The More the Merrier is celebrated for its McCrae, Jean Arthur chemistry as well. And that's Columbia. So if you think about different shades of leftism or progressivism or... like Warner Brothers you could think of as like the Bernie bro. It's convenient that they got brothers in their name. They're class reductionists. We'll be talking a lot more about that later. And RKO is more representative of the kind of proto-postmodern cultural studies leftism, which has very important effects as well.
They're the sophisticated
They're
leftists.
the feminist studio. If there's one studio that is most triumphantly feminist, it's definitely RKO in the 30s. They make movies like A Woman Rebels.
But it's so funny when we actually watch the documentary. What was that documentary about the studios?
My absolute favorite old Hollywood documentary. I like it more than the Kevin Brownlow movies. It's called Hollywood, the Golden Years, the RKO story, 6-part series.
Okay, but when you actually hear Pandro S. Berman talk, he doesn't talk like a sophisticated feminist. He talks like, I didn't care about anything but the money, and I spent all my time telling Hepburn to shut up.
Yeah, but
and go away.
It's a pose, obviously.
I know, but it's just interesting
and he's
to
like
see that kind of
75
contrast.
at the time. Pandro Berman became one of my heroes because of that series. He is talking about making his instrumental role in making some of the best movies that have ever been made, and he's so blasé about it and having so much fun downplaying all of it. But you can tell still that he's like the fire is still in there. Go and watch that series if you can, because it's not readily available anywhere. But write to us.
What else do you want to say about RKO?
I don't think we have much more that we need to say, because in general, as I think we both said, Mordden gets this one right.
He does pay more attention to the director, and I have forgotten his name. I didn't write it down. The director of Human Bondage.
John Cromwell, a great director.
John Cromwell, he talks about how it took RKO. Okay, yeah, and that's why I wrote this down as a note, because RKO also gave us the Betty Davis that we know. It wasn't Warner's. They created Betty Davis, or they let her create herself. So, which is another example of them letting a unique personality express itself.
Yeah.
Even at great risk, though with Davis at this point it paid off.
Yeah, that was what they did better than any studio, probably. If you came there and you had something really unusual to give the world...
You could give it.
You could give it, and if it made money, they would let you do it a lot. If it lost money, they would let you do it more than anyone else. And then finally, of course, they would have to let you go like they did with Katharine Hepburn. But they gave her 6 years and a lot of red ink before they finally cut their ties with her and assigned her to Mother Carey's Chickens.
And they gave us the early Hepburn, the gift of the early Hepburn, for now looking back historically.
One thing we should mention as big Little Women fans, Mordden seems to hate Louisa May Alcott, and he is grudging...
Has he ever even read it?
Probably not.
From the way he's describing it?
No, I don't think he's read it. He doesn't like the whole idea of Louisa May Alcott, but he grudgingly admits that Little Women is a great movie, somehow.
Oh, he attributes it to Cooker. So, speaking of people being allowed to express their personalities for as long as it made money, and a little while afterwards, and then afterwards being banished to the outer circles of hell, Paramount.
That's your number 2 studio?
That's my number 2 studio.
All right.
I guess you know what my number 1 studio is then. Does it surprise you?
Yeah.
It does,
I'm pleasantly surprised.
Okay. But I don't think it's for the same reasons that you would place it highly.
Well, we'll talk about that. So Paramount's your second studio.
And
Paramount
the personality I'm talking about is Joseph von Sternberg, who's going to be the subject, along with Marlene Dietrich, the movies that he made at Paramount, in other words. With Marlene Dietrich is going to be the subject of our next podcast and our first retrospective.
Our next 2 episodes will be a 2-parter on the Sternberg-Dietrich retrospective we've been going to.
That's a more coherent way to say what I was trying to say.
So yes, Joseph von Sternberg. Although for Mordden, if he's going to just use one person to describe what Paramount's about, it's definitely Lubitsch.
But Lubitsch... But it's early Lubitsch, and one of my very favorite Lubitsch films is Show Up Around the Corner, which doesn't have any of the characteristics that Mordden is focusing on, which is for MGM. And does Lubitsch then freelance after his Paramount years? Or do you not know that? Where do you make Clooney Brown?
That, I think, was probably United Artists.
Okay, I'm going to look that up while you talk about Lubitsch.
So Paramount, he calls the Sophisticate.
Wait, didn't he call RKO the Sophisticate?
No.
Called it that?
RKO is the New Yorker.
A lot of things are the Sophisticates, though. I mean, RKO and Paramount have that overlapping status, and we've now added Universal somehow to that.
So Lubitsch starts in Europe, obviously, and then he comes to the United States. I think he works for Warner Brothers briefly. Then he goes to Paramount for about 6 years. Then you get a really interesting year where Lubitsch became the head of the studio. So instead of being a director, he was the Thalberg for 1935. And that's where you get Frank Borzagi's Desire, which is a Borzagi movie that feels kind of like a Lubitsch movie.
Clooney Brown was made for Fox.
Okay.
He's
a contract director at Paramount. Then he becomes the head of the studio. Then that doesn't work out, because what director wants to be the head of a studio instead of making movies?
It's like the comic writers we were talking about being promoted to editors.
Exactly, Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas. Then he goes to MGM and makes The Merry Widow, but I think that's just on a contract. And he's sort of making movies all over the place. He does go back to Paramount because he does Bluebeard's Eighth Wife. I think that's 1938, but he does a few more at MGM. He does Shop Around the Corner. It's 1940. That's at MGM. He does Ninotchka. That's 1939. That's MGM.
Right.
Then, pretty sure that To Be or Not to Be is a United Artists thing.
I can look that up. But go ahead. Keep going.
And yeah, he may have signed some kind of a contract with Fox, because... So we got Clooney Brown. We've also got That Lady in Ermine, which is a Betty Grable movie. So that's 100% Fox. And That Sinking Feeling, I have no idea where he made that.
Yeah, you're right. It's United Artists, To Be or Not to Be.
So he's all over the place. He's not really a studio director anymore after he leaves Paramount.
So he talks about Lubitsch as the sophisticated sex guy.
Sex is theft, is what he goes back to over and over again.
From Trouble in Paradise. And then Lyson kind of inherits that, but as a lesser version?
Yeah, I think that's...
Debatable?
Well, I love Mitchell Lyson. I don't know. I think I probably do like him more than Lubitsch.
Oh, Oh,
But I like...
Go
I mean,
home.
they're both amazing.
Go home. Leave home.
If I had to choose, I might pick Mitchell Lyson over Lubitsch, but you don't have to choose. That's the thing. You can love both.
And then Sternberg fits in for sophisticated attitudes towards sex, I guess, and a sort of European flavor.
Well, the difference between RKO and Paramount in terms of, what kind of sophistication they're encouraging and what kind of uniqueness they're encouraging.
One is European and one is American?
That's part of it, but also RKO is encouraging more unique performers, whereas Paramount...
Well, other than Orson Welles.
Well, he's also a performer.
Yes, but as a director.
But Paramount is encouraging unique directors.
And I completely agree with this. Like, not only do they have Sternberg and, Lubitsch establishing himself, but they have Sturges later on as well.
Mitchell Lyson, who's basically doing his own thing. They have...
It is the studio of directors who didn't need to leave home or create their own production company in order to fully express their vision.
Right. Well, another crucial figure in Paramount history, maybe the Paramount figure, is Cecil B. DeMille, right? He only made one movie elsewhere, I think, which was the sort of ill-fated Madam Satan at MGM, which I think we're going to watch. I hope we do, for our series. But everything else is at Paramount. Now, Cecil B. DeMille has a mixed reputation. I'm not a big fan, but he's certainly distinctive. I don't think you can say he's not an auteur. And he was doing whatever the fuck he wanted at Paramount for like 30 years. So...
Well, I guess he was making money, because once Sternberg stopped making money, nobody talks about... Oh, I shouldn't go into Sternberg because we're going to talk about it in the next episode. But nobody talks about Sternberg the way they talk about Orson Welles, but his career is just as tragic.
It is. Maybe even more so.
We'll talk about that next time. Sturges' career is not tragic. And wasn't it wonderful going to this Sternberg-Dietrich retrospective and seeing how he uses comically the same players, because it's a studio of production units, the same production unit players that Sturges then uses in his comedies.
Yeah, a lot of those people are still around at Paramount 10 years later, and Sturges brings them into his troupe, yeah.
And I feel like the Lady Eve, the character, Barbara Stanwyck's character, although immensely different, could never have existed without the example of Sternberg-Dietrich character.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can see that.
Not just the type of character, the con artist, worldly adventurous.
But can you picture, I mean, obviously...
Adventure-esque.
Marlene Dietrich would not do a British accent. Or...
Well, that would be great to see, but she can't even speak English.
Exactly.
She can't even pronounce her English words. But the amount of power that Sturges gives her within the narrative, right? And the way he likes to punish his men, that's very Sternberg.
Yeah, that's a continuity for sure. So for Paramount, and I mean, he does talk about these sui generis stars as well.
And then Wilder is there as we get on in time. He makes Sunset Boulevard there.
Yeah.
Another complete auteur, even... Well, like we said, there's two kinds of auteurs. They're the ones where they seem to be company men, but then you can detect common themes or a certain quality within their work, like John Stahl.
Paramount is the studio that promoted both Sturges and Wilder from screenwriters to screenwriter-directors. No other studio did that, really.
So that means they're very much favoring the writer, not just the director.
A writer of very strong vision, yes. Who are the other writers?
And Lubitsch has his regular collaborator, Raphaelson, just like Wilder has...
Yeah, Samson Raphaelson, yeah.
Raphaelson? Who knows? And how to pronounce it. And Wilder has... who's Wilder's?
Brackett.
It is Brackett?
Charles Brackett.
Okay. I was going to say Lee Brackett, but that's not right.
Well, Charles Brackett was Wilder's screenwriting partner when they were just both writers. Like, they wrote Midnight and that kind of thing. And then...
And Sturges actually does everything. Is Lyson a writer?
No.
No, okay.
Lyson directed Midnight. He directed Easy Living. He directed...
Sturges' scripts, in other words.
Amazing movies. And,
I love Paramount. I have such affection for Paramount. Just because of this. Because of the amount of creativity they allowed.
Sometimes I quibble with Mordden's downgrading. He talks about Carol Lombard never making a first-rate movie at Paramount. I don't think that that's right, because she made some Mitchell Lyson movies, and I think they are first-rate. He does talk about that scene where, in Hands Across the Table, where she spends the night in a different room at Fred McMurray's house, and if one of them doesn't leave, the production code is going to crumble, and the movie makes you feel that. And I think that that's true. I just don't know why he underrates that movie. It's an incredible movie.
So I don't know if this is
Carol Lombard
coincidence or influence of people working at the same place, but Sturges, certainly in The Lady Eve, has a deft hand, not so much in Miracle of Morgan's Creek or anything using Eddie Bracken, but in Lady Eve he has a deft hand with eroticism as well. It's a very erotic movie.
Well,
very erotic comedy.
Sullivan's Travels is a very erotic movie.
Well, it's got Veronica Lake, so why wouldn't it be? But would you say that with the exception of George Stevens, wherever he was working, that most the directors working at Paramount really are consistently the sexiest directors? That's an odd question, but it does bear on his thesis.
Sure, I mean, I think that there's warrant for saying that.
And Lubitsch was only sexy at Paramount, really.
Well, Ninotchka is sexy.
No.
Sure it is.
Not really. How sexy can you get with, what's his face?
Melvin Douglas?
Melvin Douglas. How sexy can Melvin Douglas get?
No, I think that they've got really good chemistry.
They've got chemistry, but that's not the same thing.
Well, because the whole movie is about her finally putting her marks away enough to have sex, and I think that it really sells you on that.
I once, what did she say? Slew a Polish lancer?
Yeah, I don't
Whatever, her seduction speech about killing men, or...
Suppress it.
To complete my thesis, possibly the most erotic movie of all time was made at Paramount, which is Mavoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Although that's not the kind of light, frothy, sophisticated romantic comedy eroticism that Mordden is talking about.
No, he's talking about chic love amongst the jet set and the jewel thief set more than anything. But sure, that scene of
the leg
with Miriam Hopkins, who gets really underrated by Mordden.
Wow.
Miriam Hopkins is
really taking the Davis side in an unnecessary feud there.
She's an important performer. I mean, it's one of the biggest chapters, the Paramount chapter. It's the first chapter, and Paramount is about sexist theft. It's about encouraging directorial autonomy, but also it does have these, vaudevillian performers in front of the camera that are encouraged as well. And he talks about Mae West, he talks about W.C. Fields getting her start there.
And Sturges is
the Marx
both.
Brothers, obviously. And this is one of the main cross-studio discussions he has, but it's a discussion that anyone who's familiar with the Marx Brothers has had a million times. So if you're listening to this and you know anything about the Marx Brothers, you know about this sharp divide in their career. The Paramounts are one way, and the MGMs are a totally different way.
Like Katharine Hepburn or whatever else.
Exactly. MGM is where you go to get beaten into submission.
If you're anarchic.
Yes. And Mordden is totally taking that line, and I really don't see how you can not. The difference is so stark between the Paramounts and the MGMs, and he prefers the Paramounts, certainly. I don't see how you can argue that, although many people do think Night at the Opera is, well, I think fewer and fewer people think that Night at the Opera is better than Duck Soup, but there are some out there who think that. Actually, my favorite is probably Horse Feathers, which is also a Paramount. And
then it seems fitting, although not with the sophisticated sex part, but in terms of their anarchic comedy tradition and their encouraging idiosyncratic directors, even though they're not that studio anymore, nevertheless, Jerry Lewis shows up there to be really the last auteur at what is still called Paramount
It's still
Pictures.
Called Paramount, but yeah, it's still...
And the end of an era, because he's looking back, he's drawing in his filmmaking on old Hollywood studio genres and performers and styles.
What's the typical or the quintessential Paramount film?
I don't have one. Do you have one? There isn't one because there are so many good movies from each director. I can't even pick my favorite of a director.
Yeah, I mean, I think, though, if you're talking about the movie that the public knows the best from the Paramount studio...
I don't even know the answer to that.
It's probably The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, right?
That's
because
not a good legacy,
it
though.
shows on Easter every year, still on network TV. So.
That was one of 3 studio era movies I grew up with, or old Hollywood movies, whatever you want to call them.
Everyone's seen it.
That, Gone with the Wind, and It's a Wonderful Life.
Wizard of Oz? That used to show on TV every year, too, so...
It wasn't a ritual in our household. The other ones were holiday rituals.
You watched Ten Commandments every year?
Yeah, and I had a weird crush on Yul Brynner and his eyeliner. I was also very upset about the oppression of the slaves.
Well, good.
It was terrible.
It is terrible.
Somebody gets, like, crushed with a big stone or something at the beginning. That's all I remember. And the eyeliner.
Bad system.
Alright, number 1, Warner's. Before we completely run out of steam, that's the problem with doing descending order.
So, Warner Brothers for Mordden is certainly not in first place, it's in third place.
Although he talks about it as if it might as well be, like, as he talks about the first 3 with about equal enthusiasm and chapter length.
No, Warner Brothers has a much lower page count.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Ones after that are even lower.
Mm-hmm.
But he does talk about it very enthusiastically.
And Warner Brothers is great for a studio auteurist because it has a very powerful, pungent ethos that's hard to mistake.
So for me, what puts it in first place for me is not its social conscience. That's fun. But it's the stars. It's the studio of Bette Davis, James Cagney, John Garfield,
Errol Flynn.
And 40s Crawford.
Yeah.
Errol Flynn, not as important to me, but yeah, he's good too.
Kay Francis.
It's the studio of the Busby Berkeley Backstagers.
Yes.
Oh, which is, as far as I'm concerned, the best period of... I'm sure everyone agrees the best period of Busby Berkeley. Are there outliers on that?
Well, The Gang's All Here has many fans.
Okay.
Probably if I had to pick a favorite Busby Berkeley movie, I think
Gold
I would...
Diggers of 1933.
Yeah, that wouldn't be... That's kind of the consensus choice.
And the movies are so good. The quality of the best movies, there's just like an endless list of them. They've got High Sierra, Maltese Falcon, Casablanca's my pick for the biggest impact on public consciousness, Mildred Pierce. These are not all favorite movies of mine, but they are indelible images of Hollywood movies, and they are amazing entertainments.
Yeah, all the Davis vehicles.
All of the Davis vehicles.
You got I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which
well,
is a remarkable
not the pre
film.
of human bondage, necessarily, Davis. The vehicles.
Yeah.
After she becomes a star.
Yeah, Marked Woman, Dark Victory, The Letter. Everything, basically, except...
Jezebel.
Jezebel. Except for Little Foxes, which was made at Goldwyn.
Right. Goldwyn, who had no taste. What else? What do you want to add to Warner's?
Yeah, well, I mean...
What's your ranking? Okay, now we've revealed them all. What is your studio ranking if you were forced to do it?
Warner Brothers first, RKO second, Paramount third, maybe Universal fourth, just because I love the Laemmle Jr. era so much, and I also love Cirque and some of the other things that they did afterwards, but, you know, it gets nebulous there. Then MGM, then Fox, but even Fox I love, so again, I'm not really
as we talked
willing
about.
to give up on any of these.
Why do you love Warner's the best?
There are a lot of grounds, but certainly its leftist politics made an early mark on me and has stuck with me.
You think it influenced you watching Warner's movies? It influenced your politics?
It's hard to tell because I came to them so early and I was developing my political ideas at the same time as watching them.
But did you know that these were all Warner's movies? You had read the Mordden book and you knew that?
Well, I read the Mordden book by 1989, but I'd seen some of these movies before, and it was pretty clear that a lot of these movies that I thought were incredible and kind of eye-opening, like I'm a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, you will never get a more stirring proletarian cri de coeur than that movie coming from a studio, other than maybe Juke Girl, which is also by Warner Brothers, with Ronald Reagan taking on the capitalist system with all of his fruit-growing friends. So they made an impact on me, and I guess reading this book helped solidify that all these Cagney... And Roaring Twenties was very instrumental in helping to form, because I saw that one pretty early. Its vision of what was going on in the 20s and 30s in America definitely got as much of a place in my mind as any historical monographs I've read on the period. So they were really participating in a historiography that is still vital, I think.
I don't know, maybe Warner's really influenced I don't want to call it political development, but it influenced something getting at me through all of those Davis movies.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Davis movies were some of my favorites too. Dark Victory I watched over and over and over again.
And it's really interesting to consider and we kind of talked about this in our film podcast that never got in the air because it kept running as long as this one. Most of our episodes won't be this long, we hope. How Bette Davis and James Cagney, again, just like we talked about Hepburn at RKO, but how these personalities couldn't come from any other studio, it feels like. How they were unleashed by this studio and its particular ethos, even though it took them a while to figure out how to use Bette Davis.
Yeah.
And much longer to figure out how to use, as he talks about, Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah, but they had...
But she is the toughest woman, except for 40s Crawford, who takes over the mantle at Warner's. Toughest woman in movie history. Actually shares that with Barbara Stanwyck.
Yeah.
Okay, so there were a lot of tough women in movie history.
But Stanwyck also made a lot of movies at Warner.
And for this to be the queen of their lot, and then James Cagney, there's like so much in common between these two personalities, as Davis herself even said as various times. It was all men, and it was all tough men.
Yeah.
At the studio, sorry. Yeah.
I mean, that's not necessarily true, right? Because Olivia de Havilland was also there, and just as litigious as Cagney and Davis, and even was the one that actually won. Well, that's what he talks about.
Like, this is the studio of everybody, even though this was the proletariat FDR supporting a studio, it's a studio where all of the stars fought the mogul.
Yeah.
About over their contracts.
Exactly.
Do you think that's an irony, or...?
Being pro-FDR doesn't make you less of a capitalist, so they were still trying to make a buck. Now, I do like that he...
Oh my god, look at these movies that Crawford made at Warner's. Mildred Pierce, Humoresque, Possessed, not Daisy Kenyon. Flamingo Road, though.
Yeah.
That was Michael Curtiz.
Michael Curtiz obviously deserves to be talked about more than Mordden did in his chat. He doesn't really talk about any Warner's directors.
After Flamingo Road, it gets a little iffy for a long time. Yeah, it's just iffy after that. But that's a great to have another great string of movies like that after moving to a new studio.
Some other people that are at Warner's that I think are really important that Mordden doesn't talk about much or at all. Kay Francis, who Warner Brothers didn't really know what to do with.
She doesn't really fit what we just described.
She does in some ways. I mean, Stranded by Frank Borzage is one of my favorite Borzage movies, one of my favorite Warner movies of the 30s. And Kay Francis plays a settlement worker there, and it is really incredible. And you get into a lot of labor politics there. You get into American xenophobia. You get into all kinds of progressive stuff put across in a really zesty, romantic way, as only Borzage can. Like, it's an improbable film that I think most people haven't seen. Maybe even Mordden hadn't seen it. It kind of typifies Warner Brothers as well.
Sorry, just to amplify what I was saying about Bette Davis and James Cagney, he talks about Cagney being one of the few male stars who could play both a pure asshole or a pure victim hero. And Bette Davis had that duality about her as well.
Yeah.
So
the
person you love the star you love to hate, but then will become personification of virtue in another vehicle from the same studio.
And vulnerability. And people you can empathize with.
And they always have vulnerability, no matter how much of a bastard they're playing.
I'm not so tough. Yeah. Mordden, one thing I remember is that I'd already seen and loved The Roaring Twenties. Still one of my favorite films by Raoul Walsh, and Mordden goes into rhapsodies about that film as the great gangster movie, which is not the typical opinion, I don't think. A lot of people would prefer to focus on the early 30s gangster films, but he talks about it as kind of a valedictory for the genre, going beyond what was done in the initial items in the canon, and I agree with that. Roaring Twenties and Strawberry Blonde are essential movies for me. I talked about Strawberry Blonde last week, and those are Cagney entries that they're certainly not forgotten. Roaring Twenties is much discussed, but not as discussed as I would like, I think, still. People would still prefer to talk about Public Enemy because it was his first role.
And he's just purely unsympathetic in that. It's like Bette Davis in Of Human Bondage.
Yeah, he's mostly unsympathetic in it. But, I mean, he's got a few moments where you could see a little bit of the eventual, more complex Cagney.
To me, these personalities, this is what I love about Warner's that I didn't even realize I loved about Warner's, because I didn't think about the fact that this was all coming from the same studio. These pugnacious personalities bursting onto the screen in all of their raw energy, and some of them, not Bette Davis, but Cagney, I believe, and John Garfield, people coming right off the streets.
Sure.
At Joan Crawford.
She was coming straight from her $1 million mansion by the time she came to
But she certainly never lost the chip on her well-padded shoulders about the early years of her life.
That's true.
That this happens with Cagney, and then they repeat it again with John Garfield, although in a very different key. Garfield coming out of serious theater, however briefly.
Leftist theater, yeah.
There's something about that says studio movies to me in a sort of unexpected way. Utterly lost now in filmmaking. Utterly lost, never to be retrieved. People come out of acting school.
It's true, and this is one thing that does run through a lot of the chapters. I mean, he'll talk about the backgrounds of the stars, right? And even in MGM, he talks about how Gable and Crawford are not classy people. They come from the lowest rungs of American society. What MGM does with them is very different from what Warner Brothers does with the same class of people.
But Crawford is not... I mean, I was trying to make some kind of Mordden-like argument about a studio character here, but Crawford is not less tough at MGM. You see her with Gable, and she's about to sink her teeth into his jugular and pull it out of his neck, even if he could beat her within an inch of her life, in their very first pairings. I mean, she's not any less tough at MGM. So what would you say is different with the way that they use her at Warner's?
Well, I think he's right to point to the diction lessons that they got, right? I mean,
well, she doesn't lose that.
No, they don't talk like...
Stanwyck does.
Yeah, Stanwyck isn't at MGM.
Yeah.
That's one of the only studios Stanwyck is probably never at. Almost never.
Stanwyck keeps her
Stanwyck's
accent,
like
her
a Brooklyn
accent.
Yeah. Clark Gable, too. Like, I mean, they definitely gave him elocution lessons. He doesn't talk like Cagney talks, that's for sure. I mean, he's not from the New York ghetto. I think he's probably from Ohio or something like that. But, you know, he was a roughneck.
And the other thing is about Warner's is that it has these raw qualities, but at the same time, it is the only studio turning out big mythic stars at the level of MGM. Don't you think that's interesting?
Well, it is, and Mordden wants to discuss that, and he talks about, he focuses in a lot on the differences between Cagney and Gable, because he's got these sort of star types that he goes back to, like the dangerous man, right? So...
Well, he says Gable's not ever allowed to be really dangerous the way that Cagney is.
Well, but he says Gable is MGM's greatest star and dangerous man because he's larger than life, whereas Cagney is life. That's the way he puts it, right?
Is Cagney really life, though?
Well... For Mordden, yes, that's what he says, right? He throws off these bon mots that sometimes hit, sometimes miss. I mean,
it is wonderful hearing him with his Yiddishisms in his early movies, like that Taxi one. Is it just called Taxi?
Yeah, Taxi with an exclamation point.
Yeah. Which would not be allowed at any other studio, and particularly not at MGM.
Yeah, he does point out that Warner Brothers is the only studio that didn't avoid having... Well, after the production code, it becomes a lot harder because it actually forbids you to talk about religion in any way. It really wants to downplay any kind of talk
What about religious movies like Song of Bernadette?
I know, but you can't have any kind of levity related to religion or any kind of joking about priests or rabbis or anyone else. So it's just better to just not have them in case because you don't want to slip up, and that's what they start to do. Except in the 40s, yeah, you do.
Yes, but this is usually used so that people do not get to, in a industry run by Jewish men, so that people do not get to reference the fact that Jews exist.
Yeah, because there's terror there, and for good reason. Most of these moguls came from families that have been escaping pogroms in Russia, right? I mean, there was mass murder going on that was tied to their ethnicity.
Yeah.
So you can understand why you would want to just...
And then it's all going to happen again.
Let's not talk about this. Yeah. I mean, during the Red Scare, it all comes up again.
Well, I mean, during World War II, it all comes up again.
Well, that too, but in America, red baiting rhetoric was also anti-Semitic.
Right.
Like, there was a lot of conflation there, and it was terrifying with good reason.
To summarize, for me, Warner's has it all. It has this dark, dangerous energy. and yet it still has mythic level stars.
Yeah, it has a definite politics. I mean, it has the strongest ethos.
But it also has great women's pictures.
Sure, yeah.
So it has the melodrama, and it has the noir, and it has the politics.
Yeah.
It doesn't sacrifice anything.
I think Mordden is persuasive when he's talking about, well, where do these Errol Flynn movies fit in? And they do fit in really nicely. Like, Captain Blood is just as political as a Cagney movie.
The underrated Errol Flynn.
Errol Flynn is fantastic.
He talks like Errol Flynn didn't want to do Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex. It's Davis who didn't want him.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that's a flawed movie. It's got some issues with it, but it's certainly fascinating.
Davis doesn't have chemistry with any leading man except for freaking George Brent. She can't abide another... We've talked about this a lot. She can't abide another man... Like, she can't abide to share the screen with a man, really, as a equal co-star. She has to be the thing that's in the movie.
Yeah, that's fine, I think. I mean, why not have some movies
But she
like
doesn't
that?
have any pairings that are like Crawford and Gable.
Well, she has... I would not argue for it as a great movie, but I think...
She has a Herbert Marshall as her whipping boy.
Yeah, I think The Bride Came COD is a great pairing with Cagney. Now, the story lets them down because there is none, but I think they have a really interesting dynamic between them in that movie.
Well, it shows you, it really highlights... You can talk in the abstract about their similarities, but it really highlights their differences, which is that Davis was a middle-class girl who took her own elocution lessons and came from the theater, from New England, a New England Puritan. And Cagney, as we said, comes from the streets of New York.
When she finds out that he's been hiding a sandwich on her when they're trapped in that mine shaft, it's amazing.
The two toughest characters in movie history just doesn't go the way that Crawford and Gable goes. Neither of them are really sexual in a primary way the way that Gable and Crawford are. That's the difference between them. Both of them are not particularly sexual.
Yeah, I think that's true. That's where MGM differs from Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers is a more existential.
William Wyler can get excited about Bette Davis and make her very sexy, but her sexiness for the camera isn't the same thing as her sexiness for a co-star.
Well, her sexiness in the letter, it's tied to her erotic obsession with a man that she kills in the first seconds of the movie. So we don't get to see her with that guy. Presumably it was a hot relationship, if it got her bothered enough to shoot him a lot. But yeah, he's not in the movie.
Warner's loves to end movies with women shooting men. It's one of their
but the
hallmarks.
letter starts with...
Well, that's true.
That's
Begin
the first
it,
scene.
end it, in between. You know, Van Heflin really gets it, and Curtis Bernhardt's possessed.
Yes.
Oh, we gotta wrap it up. So,
I mean,
what is this series that this has been the 4-hour or whatever preamble to?
There's a million more things we can say about studios, and I think that we'll probably get to a lot of them as we go through the series, at least once a month for the next decade or so, more, hopefully 10 decades. We'll be talking about movies, 2 movies by a particular studio, but in a particular year. We're going to start out with 1930 Paramount. That'll be coming after we do our retrospective talk. So
we're going to try to go for deep cuts, but if there is a very familiar movie that we want to revisit, or a midway known one that we want to promote, that will be included as well.
And we will be keeping in mind Mordden's characterization of the studio, our own feelings about it, whether we think that the movie that we're watching makes any sense under the rubric that Mordden has bequeathed to us, or whether we want to go off in our own direction. And it'll be accumulative. So once we've gone through several years and doubled back, this is a long-term project. We're going to start to have a lot of things to say about the studios, and watching them year by year, sort of comparing them to other movies by the studio as we march through the decades, but also as we compare them to movies made the same year by a totally different studio. Like, where are the similarities? Are the lines so stark, or are they not? We're going to be considering all of those ideas. I think we're going to have to make space as well for auteurism to creep back in if we happen to get a product that seems more to be coming from a particular director or writer or star.
Or we can just talk
anything.
about directors that are consistently fabulous, even though there aren't necessarily recurrent themes, like Goulding.
And Dieterle. Yeah. So obviously all of that's going to come into play. Now, I think that's going to be 3 weeks from now, and then we're going to do our Jennifer Jones. So I guess that's all we have to say for now, but of course, this is not our last word on studios. We got a million more things to say about them, and we'll know more and more as the years go by. If you have opinions on the studios, why not send us your ranking of these studios and tell us how you feel about them? You know, if you're out there and you want to write to us, this is a great touchstone thing to key in on. It's easy to make a little list and have some little comments. It's almost a pre-written email right there. So love to hear from you on that or anything else. If you think that this whole idea of Mordden's is bunk, I'd love to hear about that too. Just your experience with thinking about these studios as clearly demarcated producers of film. I just genuinely don't know how many people think of movies that way.
Do you have your own wild fan fiction theory about particular heads of production?
Yeah.
Tell us.
And we have a letter this week. Our first There's Sometimes a Buggy letter from Todd Murray.
We just read it over together at the same time.
It's a very long letter, as any letter about someone's history with film should be.
I was very pleased with this response because our decision to do a very biographical or autobiographical introductory episode, the thing I like about doing things like that, or hearing things like that, or reading things like that, is that it prompts my own recollections.
Yes, and we hope that it does spark that for a lot of people listening to.
That's the whole point of it.
Yeah,
as well as just giving
episode.
You a flavor of us.
Yeah.
A flavor, a taste, a long taste. Todd is a Gen Xer.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
As are we. Todd's about the same age as us, just a couple years older, I believe, just based on when he went to high school and that kind of thing.
So I can't really fault him for saying that his inaugural cinephilic experience with Star Wars, since I talked about Xanadu and Annie. So I really don't have a leg to stand on in terms of criticizing anybody's early cinematic experiences. Also, we mentioned he talks about watching Godzilla on Sunday morning movies, and I actually mentioned that in this podcast. My only knowledge of King Kong as a child was watching those Godzilla movies.
Sure. Godzilla even had a cartoon where he was kind of friendly, and I think there was like a little baby Godzilla, like Scrappy in the Scooby-Doos.
Church made me miss some good things, like glimpses of Julie Newmar's Catwoman. Julie Newmar's birthday yesterday. It's now yesterday.
That's true. Yeah, we're recording on late Saturday night.
Dave was admiring her figure, her 86-year-old figure. It's still looking great, just as great as I remembered it when I was 7, watching those old Batman TV shows. I
would listen to a My Living Doll podcast religiously.
Well, that's where my Twitter handle comes from.
Todd mentions that a lot of his experiences of film came on TV, just all kinds of things like Abbott and Costello,
also mentioned in this podcast.
Yeah, 10 Commandments, which we just mentioned as maybe the Paramount film that from the studio era that most people see. Ben-Hur, All the Bible Thing, Longest Day, Bridge Too Far, and of course, pretty regular screenings of The Wizard of Oz. And we also talked about that, right? So
yeah.
And we had no idea that this was coming. So
it's a common Gen X experience.
It is.
Although he doesn't mention It's a Wonderful Life.
No, that's true.
Which was I was actually terrified of It's a Wonderful Life when I was a small child. I was terrified of It's a Wonderful Life and Gone with the Wind because George Bailey and Scarlett O'Hara were so unstable and mean.
No, they can snap.
And they just didn't seem like people who would be able to take good care of children. I think George Bailey definitely. Actually, both of them. Terrible parents.
Why must you torture the children?
Got over that as I got older. Obviously, It's a Wonderful Life now one of my favorite films. I do love Scarlett O'Hara as well.
Todd speaks about going to see Star Wars at the Lowe's State downtown in New Orleans. So there's a link because I saw Superman at the Lowe's. So there's a Lowe's in every big city in North America, or there was, certainly probably not anymore.
In Montreal, though, you didn't have to worry about the history of theaters being desegregated.
Yeah, well, that's a very different context from Montreal.
By the way, Star Wars wasn't a terribly important movie to me, but I definitely have female friends for whom it was just as important. Particularly crushes on, okay, what's this, Mark Hamill?
Not Han Solo.
No, I had a crush on Han Solo.
You were obsessed with him in Carbonite.
Well, that too. But, I mean, just in general, I had a crush on Han Solo. But, my friends often spoke, rather of Blondie.
We're skipping a little bit here. The next goalpost he talks about is getting greater mobility and being able to experience looking for Mr. Goodbar, Eyes of Laura Mars. He says he believes he saw Bringing Up Baby around then as well, which is interesting.
And then started seeing every movie in a theater that he possibly could. A 2.5-year period where he went to every movie that came out.
Amazing. Yeah, sort of my experience in the late 90s.
I have never had this experience. Never ever wanted to see every movie that came out.
I like this. On dates, I saw a lot of stuff like Kiss of the Spider Woman and Brazil. I'm sure those were good conversation
sound like fun
pieces.
Dates.
Yeah. He also mentions that he owns every 12-inch vinyl Duran Duran ever produced.
Unfortunately, one's funds have to be diverted to different obsessions. Before the internet era, they did.
That's right. So then he says, let me back up slightly and talk about my David Lynch history, even though I understand in theory this is not a Lynch podcast.
It must be in some symbolic way, though.
Yeah.
Considering how we've named it.
Oh, yeah.
A presiding spirit.
The Elephant Man crossed his radar through cable.
So this Channel M, New Orleans Channel M, the same company that was the beginning of Movie Channel and Stars, they would run ads on the UHF channels, the purpose of which was to sell you on how important it was to see movies uncut in their original form, and they had this weird way of cutting them so that they showed you only the most disturbing moments that they could get away with on regular TV. That's how I was introduced to the Elephant Man. He says he started dreaming Lynch stuff at this point, but the dream quality was more like Eraserhead than Elephant Man. Even though he wasn't aware of Eraserhead yet. I don't know, there's that beginning with the woman clearly being raped by a bunch of elephants. Like, what else is that supposed to be?
Well, trampled.
Oh, come on. And giving birth to the Elephant Man? Because she was trampled? I don't think so.
Okay. It's true. Then he mentioned...
That would give you some weird dreams.
So then once he went to college at LSU, dollar theaters, including one right outside of campus. So again, this mirrors my experience a little later on in Montreal with the Palace Theater. So these were wonderful times for going to see affordable screenings of movies.
And he's getting introduced to some of the canon, Buñuel, Antonioni, and such.
He did his first writing on film. He had some film classes. Oh, and the video movie guide, I had that one too. I remember having that. So this was comparable to the Leonard Maltin guide. Just wonderful. You know, these were the only resources you could get a hold of back then to spur you on to ever greater feats of cinephilia.
And then saw Blue Velvet, which at the time stuck out a little.
But mainly just one out of many things I was getting into and learning about.
Blue Velvet. Yeah, Blue Velvet didn't really take off for me. I can't remember at this point. I was introduced to Eraserhead. I think I must have told this story on one of our episodes, one of our hundreds of podcast episodes. I had a best friend in my early teens who had a boyfriend who was slightly older and just knew about everything, about music, about movies, cult movies, that sort of thing. He showed me Eraserhead. I couldn't have cared less. Also Dune. I saw Dune through him. But I think he mainly showed me the part where the Emperor, sort of floats around in the air, which was cool. That's all I remembered from it anyway. And he told me about Blue Velvet. He didn't actually have it. But I don't know whether I saw Blue Velvet before or after I saw Twin Peaks. That's the thing. I know that it terrified me. As a woman, it absolutely terrified me. And
Blue Velvet did.
Blue Velvet did. And other than that, I really didn't have any other way to come to terms with it. So my early experiences of Lynch movies were fear.
Sure. Well, that's reasonable.
But he was on my radar. So then I felt very in the know and smart when I started hearing about Twin Peaks. I was like, oh, I know who that is. He's that art director. and he's going to bring art to the benighted TV-watching masses.
That's how you thought of it.
That's how I thought of it. So I was very into the Lynch-directed episodes in the first season, and the artier they got, the more I liked it, the more I liked the boundaries being pushed. What about you, Dave?
Yeah, for Lynch, it was definitely Twin Peaks.
Was that your first Lynch experience, Twin Peaks?
Yeah. Then I went back and saw the other things. Blue Velvet, I was too young to go see it in the theater, because I would have been 12 when it came out.
Twin Peaks, for me, was happening during a period where I had, for the first time, developed taste in television. And I found there were a lot of things happening in TV at the time that I thought were amazingly cutting edge, late 80s, early 90s, that I thought were just going to change the face of our culture and make the world a better and more sophisticated place.
What, other than...
Roseanne. Ha! Boy, did that not happen.
Well, it did, but
it did, and
now Roseanne is
the world did not become a better and sophisticated place, and
neither did she.
Neither did she. Roseanne was one, early Simpsons, and I really thought the face of the world was going to be changed by all this TV bringing a new sensibility into the homes of middle North America. Kids in the Hall.
Right.
A Canadian show, but also a cult hit in America.
When did that start? Isn't that...
Lorne Michaels produced it. It showed
early 90s?
It showed on CBC uncensored, which it did not.
Yeah.
In the States, but it was an American production of a Canadian show. A Canadian troupe, also filmed in Toronto.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you asking about it?
When did it start?
Late 80s, I think, like around 88.
Yeah?
Yeah.
That early?
Yeah.
I wasn't watching it. I wasn't watching a lot of TV, but I did have a few shows I adored, like, Twin Peaks for sure, but also Alf.
Did you think Alf was going to make the world a better and more sophisticated place?
I still love Alf, and I really liked Murphy Brown as well, but I didn't think it was cutting edge. I just really enjoyed it. So we hear about a lot of the cool stuff that you can get into as the technology became a little bit more user-friendly and accessible. VCRs, DVDs, obviously.
So here he is discovering Twin Peaks. This during medical school.
Yes.
Okay, we're condensing. We're probably misrepresenting things here because we're condensing so much. In college medical school...
He says, it was during this period when I found out another one of the residents had all of Twin Peaks on VHS and a copy of the International Pilot. And he says, remember, this was not on the VHS set. I could rent Fire Walk with Me, and I watched them with my wife all in one weekend, which was like a Paul on the Road to Damascus moment.
Oh, that was binge watching before there was binge watching.
Yeah. So a conversion happened right here, and it's all due...
Oh, it's a very late in life conversion to...
20s, probably like early 20s, yeah.
To cinephilia, after which you'd already experienced many more movies than I ever would have before having a conversion experience. That experience reprogrammed my brain more than any other single event for watching filmic entertainment.
That's very reasonable.
He says he started thinking more about symbolism in film.
I started to think about what was going on in movies in a new way, and this stigma stays with me. I have to understand what the movie is trying to communicate to me, not just have the experience and understand it on the surface. It wasn't just me, I think. I think that the Lonely Souls episode of Twin Peaks is where David Lynch becomes the David Lynch he is now. Major statement, I think. Very defensible opinion. I think I would probably even agree with it. What do you think? And Lonely Souls is the episode that turned you off Lynch for a long time, but that's a strong reaction, so...
Well, yeah, it turned me off Lynch until Mulholland Drive.
Right.
I just had a very...
it's a powerful episode, one way or the other.
It was the same period of TV for me, and I had very violent reactions to the TV I love. Very violent, immediate reactions to TV. Kids in the Hall, I could get rhapsodic about them for a whole season, and then another season would happen, and they would slightly change their style, and I would loathe them and go like ranting on about what crap they'd turned into. I just had very volatile feelings about it. TV was like a really immediate experience for me. It felt like pulse on the moment of the culture, right? Yeah. More than anything else. More even than music. A lot of the music I was listening to was not absolutely contemporary, and it certainly wasn't being broadcast on a weekly basis. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I had a very personal relationship with David Lynch, and that he had
betrayed you
by
killing Maddie.
Well, he'd already betrayed betrayed me by, I don't know, I didn't think, well, I don't know, I'm misremembering this now because I'm remembering the fact that he didn't direct all the episodes was a betrayal already.
Well, but that was true in the first season as well.
Yeah, but that's exactly the thing. Like, I think I had been away from the show for a bit. Because the other episodes that were not directed by Lynch, I detected a distinct falling off.
Sure.
From peak experience, and I had been kind of wanting them all to be peak experience. And so I think I drifted away from the show, and then like everybody else, I heard that the killer was going to be revealed. So I came back, and then that scene happened, and I was talking about already being terrified of the violence against women in Lynch's films.
Sure.
And this was not a thing that I was prepared. My television context didn't take this in, and I was not prepared to see that.
It is happening again.
And
it is deeply, deeply upsetting. There's no doubt.
And the scene was very, very, very sick. It's not just violent, it's sick. The death scene. And I was just not prepared emotionally to see this on television when I was 16.
Quite drawn out, and she really suffers.
And I've talked about this before, but I also felt like it was simultaneously the most obvious thing that could happen, that her father is her murderer and sexually abusing her, and that it also cheated on that I'm not the only person to feel that. It also cheated on that by giving this weird Bob excuse.
Oh yeah.
That was like doubly sensational at the same time. So it's a demon rapist, murderer, and her father. Anyway, it all combined to just make me want to vomit. I do agree with Dave now that Fire Walk with Me, like, David Lynch does these things and then he justifies them by the fact that he actually takes responsibility for them, which most artists who do things that sick and violent. I mean, the man is a Francis Bacon fan.
Mm-hmm.
Most artists who are interested in things that sick and violent do not justify them.
Right.
I don't think. So yeah, I think Fire Walk with Me justifies that moment. I wasn't prepared to feel that way at the time. Fire Walk with Me would have just made me angrier.
I wonder, did we talk about this last week? I mean, when I watched Lonely Souls...
But I mean, many women had different reactions. It's not like this was a typical female reaction. It was just my reaction.
Yeah, but when I watched Lonely Souls, what struck me the most was, obviously there was this horrible thing happening back at the Palmer house. But what always stayed with me from that episode was what was going on at the Roadhouse with all of her friends being basically told that their friend was being murdered and that they were doing nothing about it, and they're all crying at the Roadhouse. The tragedy of their inability to help is what stuck with me, rather than the sensory overload of this insane Bob murder. If you're taking the murder as the primary scene in the episode, then sure, I can see why it would make you not want to tune in anymore.
I don't know how a scene like that is not asking you to react the way I did.
Yeah, no, it probably is.
Is intended to be sick and horrifying.
Yeah.
That's the intention. And, I mean, I think I've always thought that my reaction to it was valid.
Sure.
What's not valid, just like Roger Ebert's review of Blue Velvet, your reaction can be valid, but if you're going to then try to make a value judgment based on it, that's probably not a good idea.
No, I would agree.
All I knew is that I didn't want to come anywhere near David Lynch for the rest of my life. But at the same time, thinking back to early Twin Peaks, I also did want to. And so I was, like I say, looking for a way back, which was Mulholland Drive.
For Todd, it was more Inland Empire.
I love Inland Empire.
Of course, me too.
Which I managed to catch just by pure chance. Managed to catch in the theater just by pure chance. I happened to be in Toronto for like a week, the week it was playing. I think probably at the Royal Cinema.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I went and saw that with my friend. And at the end of it, I said that I was fully prepared for it to go on for another 9 hours. That would have been okay. Forever, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think we told these stories when we did our Inland Empire episode, but in case people didn't listen to that one, I have a distinct memory of going to see Inland Empire in Montreal with my friend Bradley, and we also saw Spider-Man 3 that day, so that was a real strange double feature.
He says that Inland Empire redirected my efforts to understand into deeper theoretical territory and caused me over the course of several years to build an interpretive apparatus and an understanding of the way certain types of themes work. That's why I approach things the way I do now, which has its limitations, such as I can't ever experience an entire movie without starting to read it, based on something I'm sensing in it, so I wind up not having a true primary experience very much. I really identify with that. My problem is that I can't watch a movie anymore, and this has been a problem for many years. By the time I finish watching the movie, I have an essay on it written. You know this, Dave, because the second we walk out of a theater, I start giving you my essay. I like to bounce it off of you, because then I can, if I'm hearing a different reaction, I can know that maybe I've created like a formal structure that isn't actually true to the immediate experience of the film.
Yeah, but I think we have a good synergy there, because I'm more the kind of viewer that is immersed and really doesn't start to formulate any ideas until later. Usually when we leave the TIFF Lightbox, we're walking up John Street, we go through Grange Park, and you're hitting me with all these ideas about what was going on in the movie, and I'm usually not talking at all, and then you're like, are you going to say anything? What do you have to say about this? You're just not going to talk about it. And then finally I do start talking about it, and it does spur me to come up with ideas that I probably wouldn't have until several days after, usually. So
I envy your experience, I have to say. But if there are any movies that I can watch without formulating any ideas about them while watching, they would be Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire. And then I just let the experience wash over me, and I have no idea what it means. So I'm actually grateful for David Lynch that he can do that. I do admit that I don't know what Mulholland Drive would have been like if I hadn't gone to it with already the critics providing the dream framework.
That's fascinating.
I can't unwatch. It's like knowing about the turn of screw madness interpretation before you read it. You can't ever unsee it.
Right.
Ever. You can see other ways of looking at it, but you can't ever unsee that framework. So that it was both good and bad to go into it that way. Good in that the framework provided me with a very profound emotional experience that I might not have had otherwise. I might have just been really confused.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's no wrong way to experience a film, though, I think.
Yes, there is. Most ways.
And Todd mentions that this analytical approach has guided him in his Tumblr investigations, and it's the 6th birthday of his Tumblr, so definitely worth mentioning.
Not format in which I succeeded. Like so many internet formats.
His Tumblr is
LiveJournal. I succeeded at LiveJournal.
But his Tumblr is a lot of actual essays on there. Very interesting stuff. We should actually link to it in this episode.
I tried Tumblr a very long time ago.
So that's a lot of words describing probably misremembered history of the experiences of someone who we've never met face to face, but I hope that sheds some light on me as an interlocutor going forward. During this period, I've watched a lot of old movies, but my focus hasn't been on them as more than another thing of many, many things I am into. This podcast will likely help with that.
That would be cool.
I'm also interested, though, to see if you guys like trash cinema and bad movies, psychological horror, abstract visual works, good sci-fi, and other categories. But I think I should probably stop here. It would take something like 20...
We've already been going on for longer than 20 minutes, haven't we?
Well, yeah, so we wanted to excerpt from it so that we could react. And yeah, I hopefully we did an okay job of representing.
Do we like trash cinema? No.
Well...
The answer is no.
I like
to hear people talk about it sometimes if they're interesting.
There was a film series in Toronto that had been going for several years before I got here, and was still ongoing until recently when the guy that did it moved away.
We like some things that are considered trash cinema.
Yeah, the Trash Palace.
Yeah. He
played some cool movies on 16mm, but it's true that when I wind up liking a movie, I think of it as not trash.
like the Verhoeven's.
But I do like, culturally disreputable things quite
Jerry
often.
Lewis.
A lot of the things I like, I'm not sure that anyone would... Carnival of Souls, is that trash cinema? No. Not really.
It's been recuperated.
Exactly.
I talked about my teenage experience of watching Valley of the Dolls several times with my best friend and quoting from it and things like that. But that was a very brief period for me. We're just into other things, that's all.
Yeah.
You can't pursue everything.
Good sci-fi, definitely.
Psychological horror, Roman Polanski.
Yeah, sure.
But more recent horror has left me very, very alienated. Like, I just don't understand how recent movies are even put together. Again, David Lynch, do you consider David Lynch psychological horror? Like,
yeah, I feel like you have to, don't you?
Yeah.
So that's one.
So theoretically, yes, but anything contemporary I will probably hate. I don't know what's wrong with me. I can't explain it. I don't know why I dislike all contemporary movies unless they're made by David Lynch. Abstract visual works. Michael Snow? Like Michael Snow?
Michael Snow. Certainly interesting. I don't know if Michael Snow really has the same kind of reputation in the US that he has in Canada. He's a Canadian filmmaker. I guess his most famous film is Wavelength, which is like, a 30-minute movie, which is just a zoom, an extended zoom going bigger and bigger and bigger until you just see a thing on a wall. It's certainly interesting. And then he did Wavelength for Those Who Don't Have the Time, where he just folded the film onto itself several times so that it's
there's actually a TIFF series named Wavelength, I think. Yeah.
Well, it's probably the most famous Canadian abstract film. So
Maya Deren?
Well, that's not really abstract. No,
neither
symbolic.
is Joseph Cornell. They're not narrative films, but they're not really abstract.
Stan
either.
Brakhage, I guess.
I don't know anything about Stan Brakhage.
I mean, I've seen a few things,
so
but
the short answer again is no.
Well, it's not something that we've explored at all, I don't think.
Don't think we ever will.
Probably not, but you never know.
Good I think I know. Good sci-fi. Okay, what do you like that's good sci-fi?
Well, I guess I have to say most of my favorite sci-fi texts are more books, right? Like, certainly Philip K. Dick is one of my favorite writers, but the films based on his books...
Other than Total Recall.
Total Recall is fantastic, and I guess you could consider that good sci-fi, but I just think of it as another great Paul Verhoeven movie. Paul Verhoeven has dabbled in quite a lot of sci-fi, as you say, RoboCop. Also, I guess Hollow Man, although that's probably his weakest film. It wasn't entirely released the way he would have wanted, I don't think, either. I do like Star Trek quite a lot, although I'm not sure that I consider any Star Trek movies to be great movies. But, Wrath of Khan is a very good movie.
We're so ignorant on this topic, I don't even know what would be considered a good sci-fi movie.
I don't know.
Like now.
Arrival? We watched that for the podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't love it, but I thought it was really interesting. I enjoyed talking about it.
Yeah, I guess our only real experience of that would be the movies that we watched for the Time Travel podcast.
Yeah, some of them.
Is Solaris good sci-fi?
No, it's a great movie.
Yeah.
It is, I guess it's sci-fi. Of
course it's sci-fi.
So we like it, yeah.
There you go. Short answer to all that is no.
We're certainly not only going to be talking about studio age films on the podcast, although it is going to be a big part of the show. Certainly, especially while we're doing Jennifer Jones along with doing the Hollywood studios year by year.
That could mislead you because that won't always be the case.
But when we start doing Setsuko Hara for a year, then, we're going to be totally outside of Hollywood for sure, once a month. And special episodes could be on anything, and our retrospective episodes will often be...
Well, in terms of trash cinema, I guess the only trash cinema we do know and like is the cheapy B noirs.
Yeah, but again...
The detours.
I don't feel like that counts anymore because it's got...
Born to Kill, I don't know, I think you still have to categorize Born to Kill as artful trash. I don't think you can really... that doesn't have a reputation like the Black Cat, like the Elmer movies
You'd be surprised. No, I think a lot of noiristas love it.
But isn't the whole point of trash cinema that it does have its defenders as an aesthetic?
Yes, but there are two ways to defend it. One is to say, this is a good movie by the same standards that I judge other movies, and another is to say, this is an assault upon bourgeois sensibilities and it's garbage and I love it for being garbage. Now,
that's a fine line sometimes.
I know. Yeah, it is. It is. And in the comics realm, I certainly often, when I was doing the hard and heavy blogging in 2003 against the cultural prestige crew that really wanted to elevate the medium, in quote unquote, or pushing comics forward was the big motto. You know, I recoiled from that because I liked the idea of comics taking place in a cultural realm that was parallel to, you know, whatever, the middle brow, and could get away with things that mainstream novel or graphic novel wouldn't really be able to. I have similar feelings about that in the film realm. Like, I'm not very interested in any medium being treated as respectable, but it doesn't really wind up leading me to champion things that some of the podcasts that I listen to, these guys are really into trash. And I like hearing them talk about it.
But it doesn't make me want to watch it.
You know, like real grade Z martial arts films and that kind of thing. And they find beauty in it. And, you know, I just don't. I'm not interested.
Beauty and poetry. So many of the films that we talk about in our, depending on what we can find, what we can dig up, in our Studios Year by Year series will be movies that nobody likes.
Yeah, this will be...
Nobody defends. But they're not assaults on bourgeois sensibilities. They're more likely to be bourgeois sensibilities. They're middle brow. The problem with them, insofar as there's a problem, is that they are middle brow.
Yeah, that's probably why they haven't been celebrated.
But we can find a lot to love in the middle brow.
Yeah, I do love the middle brow.
We can find a lot of trash in the middle brow.
Yeah. So we'll see where that takes us. That's probably, I mean, certainly in the pre-code era, we're going to see a lot of...
You say we're no-brow cinephiles?
We try to keep
not the high brow, not the low brow.
We try to keep the brows out of it.
I think we should end on that.
Yes. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of...
A little bit of nonsense.
Sometimes we're not even sure where this podcast is going to go, what we might take up or celebrate in years to come. So it's a voyage.
We're happy to hear you defend anything.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
you think is a really good or important movie experience that you've had.
Yep. And if you're out there and you'd like to send us your film biography or film origin, please do. We will definitely engage with it on the podcast next week and in the weeks to come. So see you next time for the beginning of our Sternberg-Dietrich TIFF retrospective coverage.
Dietrich referred to those movies in her later years as kitsch. Nothing but kitsch.
Well, we'll see about that.